Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In today's video, we're diving into two stories about people traveling through some of the most remote parts of West Virginia, who ended up crossing paths with hitchhikers. The moment I got these stories, I knew I had to put them together in one video. I'm not exactly sure why, but something about them just feels connected. I'm really curious to hear what you think. Let me know in the comments if you picked up on the same feeling. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Our little community keeps growing, and trust me, that support helps more than you know when it comes to creating better and better videos for you. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. I've lived in West Virginia all my life. It's a small town tucked into the Appalachian hills, the kind of place most people just drive through without ever stopping. At the time of this story, about 15 years ago, I was at one of my lowest points. I was working a dead-end job at a warehouse down near the old strip mine. Long hours, little pay, and nothing that made me feel like I mattered. It wore me down a little more every day. That night in particular, I remember exactly how hollow I felt. Like I was running on fumes, just a body moving through the motions, clocking in and clocking out, like some kind of broken machine. I wasn't living, I was just enduring. Even now, all these years later, I still think about what happened that night. I was driving home after my night shift at the warehouse. It was a little past 3 in the morning, and the roads were empty like they always are. That stretch of highway between the old mining facility off Route 52 and my neighborhood near the edge of Gilbert doesn't see much traffic, especially not midweek. I was exhausted, running on black coffee and muscle memory, zoning out to the hum of my tires and the low drone of the heater. Somewhere between mile marker 71 and the old marathon station just before the Buffalo Mountain turnoff, I saw someone on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. But as I got closer, I realized it was a guy standing just off the shoulder, hoodie pulled up, hands stuffed into his pockets, face angled down like he didn't want to be seen. Normally, I don't stop for anyone, especially not in the middle of the night and especially not in this part of the country. But that night, I don't know. He looked young, skinny, like he didn't have much left in him. I passed him, but something made me slow down. I checked my mirrors, and against my better judgment, I pulled off just ahead of him and waited. He got in without hesitation. Didn't say much, just gave a name, and asked to be dropped off somewhere south. Nothing specific. His voice was flat, and he barely looked at me. He sat stiff, like he didn't want to take up space, holding a beat-up backpack close to his chest. At first, I figured he was just down on his luck. Maybe a kid trying to get out of town. Or more likely, some dumbass who watched a YouTube video about hiking the Appalachians and thought he'd give it a shot. Middle of the night, scared out of his mind, already regretting every decision that brought him there. Happens more often than people think. There's this whole idea going around, especially with kids, that spending a night alone in the mountains is some kind of rite of passage, like it'll make you tougher or prove something. But the truth is, there's shit out here. Real shit. And most of those kids either bail before sunrise or come stumbling out of the woods looking like they saw the devil himself. I still tried to make some small talk, see how old he was. Sometimes they look young, but when you get a better look, they're full-grown adults who just haven't had an easy life. But he kept quiet. Short answers. Nothing more than a few words at a time. Just stared out the window like he was waiting for something to happen. But as the minutes passed, I started noticing little things. His boots were caked with dried mud, but not the kind you get from walking trails. More like he'd been standing in wet fields or near a creek bed. His jeans were stained. Not just dirt, something darker, scattered in odd patterns near the knees and along the thighs. His hoodie had smudges around the pocket area that didn't quite look like grease. I tried not to jump to conclusions. People get dirty. People sleep rough. But there was something else. An odor. It was faint and metallic. Almost like rust. Not strong enough to choke you, but it was there, under the surface. He didn't ask about me. Didn't care where I was headed or what I did. He didn't even seem curious about the route I was taking. Just stared out the window, barely blinking, both hands wrapped tight around that bag. About 20 minutes into the drive, we came up on a roadblock. 2 patrol cars, lights flashing, and a couple officers checking IDs. I thought the whole thing was weird as hell. You don't really see cops out here unless something genuinely bad has gone down. I slowed down, rolled down the window. One of them shined a flashlight into the cab, asked a few basic questions. Where I was coming from, where I was going. He looked at the guy in the passenger seat for a moment too long. My passenger tensed up, shoulders tight, jaw clenched. He kept his head down, barely made eye contact. When the officer asked for his name, he gave a different one than the one he'd told me. I caught it immediately, and my stomach dropped. To this day, I still can't remember the name he gave me at first. It's like it vanished completely from my memory. But I know for a fact it wasn't the same one he gave the cops. The officer hesitated. I could tell he was sizing things up. At that point, another cop started walking toward the car. From the uniform, I could tell he held a higher rank than the one talking to us. I asked what was going on, trying to keep my tone casual. And the officer said, bodies had been found. I can't even explain what I felt in that moment. It was like panic, but frozen, like my brain couldn't decide whether to run or shut down completely. I had no reason to think the kid was involved. Yeah, he looked rough, covered in mud and something reddish, but he didn't feel like a killer. He just seemed lost. Scared, maybe. Not dangerous. As soon as those words left the cop's mouth, the other one called him over and pulled him aside. He didn't scold him in front of us, but I could tell right away he wasn't supposed to share that info. A moment later, the second cop waved us off, signaling that we could go. The second we were clear of the lights, the atmosphere in the car shifted. My hands were shaking slightly on the wheel. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me now, like he knew I'd noticed. I kept my mouth shut, but my heart was thudding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I tried to stay calm. Thought about turning off into one of the small towns we were approaching. Somewhere with lights. People. But I didn't want to let on that I was suspicious. I just kept following the road, playing it cool, trying to act like I hadn't picked up on anything. Not even 10 minutes after we'd passed the cops, he got a message on his phone and completely flipped out. Raised his voice, loud, sharp, sudden, scared the hell out of me. He demanded to get out of the car. I told him we were in the middle of nowhere, that there was a gas station just a few minutes ahead, but he wasn't having it. Kept insisting, more and more aggressive, until I had no choice but to pull over and let him out. Truth is, I wanted him gone. That outburst only confirmed what I'd already started to suspect. After he slammed the door and walked off into the dark, I drove straight to the gas station and called the police. Told them I had just dropped off a kid about 3 minutes up the road. I said something felt off about him, that I was genuinely concerned. On the other end, they asked if he had a beard and light hair. I told them yes. They thanked me and said someone would follow up later. I think that's when the scariest part of the story really started. The cop had said bodies had been found. so I searched. Every newspaper I could find, every local bulletin. I even asked around. People who lived nearby, folks who worked along that stretch of road. Nothing. No one had heard a thing. When I didn't get a call back from the police, I drove to the station myself and demanded answers. All they told me was that they didn't know what I was talking about. They made me feel like I was losing it, like I'd imagined the whole thing or dreamed it. And honestly, if it weren't for the dirt he left on the passenger seat, I might have believed I had hallucinated the whole thing. All these years later, there was never any follow-up. No news story. No forum thread. Nothing. Just silence. Like it never happened. What I'm about to tell you happened about a year ago, during one of my many road trips. Those solitary journeys where I drive for long stretches without a fixed destination, just aiming to soak in the scenery, explore small trails, and feel the freedom of being alone in the world. I've always loved that sense of adventure, but the truth is, my car, old and without air conditioning, forced me to do most of the driving at night. Especially now that spring was pushing temperatures up to uncomfortable levels for anyone crossing deep into the heartland. That particular night, I started driving around 10:30 p.m., fully aware that I wouldn't reach my planned destination until close to 5 in the morning. I was passing through West Virginia, specifically one of its most remote stretches in the Appalachians. A region that, to be completely honest, had never really won me over, though its winding roads and dense forests held a raw, authentic beauty. I'd carried bad memories of that place for years, after a hike gone wrong left me with a lingering sense of unease every time I passed through. Still, the shortcut was worth it, and I moved forward without much hesitation. The road, as you'd expect at that hour, and in such a remote area, was swallowed in total darkness. Except for a few rare moments when I reached higher ground and could spot the scattered lights of isolated homes on distant hills. The solitude was absolute. The silence was so complete that at times, it felt like even my car was an intruder in that unchanging, frozen landscape. It was during one of these stretches that something, hidden among the thick trees lining the road, caught my attention. A strong, intense light, like the beam of a flashlight, cut through the darkness for just a few seconds. Between my speed and the suddenness of the moment, I couldn't make out exactly what it was, and I didn't even consider slowing down to check it out. Whatever it was, I much preferred it stayed far away from me. I kept driving for several miles until, all of a sudden, I was hit with an urgent need to pee. Something that, due to a health condition I developed a few years back, comes on suddenly and uncontrollably, even though I'm still relatively young. I didn't have much choice. I had to pull over right there, on the side of the road, surrounded on all sides by dense forest, while the darkness around my car felt almost solid. I parked, opened the door, and had barely started to relieve myself when, out of nowhere, a man came screaming out of the shadows like some flesh and blood ghost, pointing a long rifle straight at my chest. Without giving me a second to react, he demanded that I let him into the car, yelling that I had two options: either give him a ride, or he'd take the car by force. In a moment of pure terror, I briefly considered trying to reach the small pistol I kept in the glove box, but realized I didn't stand a chance. He was already way too close. I motioned for him to get in, trying to stay as calm as I could while mentally begging him not to hurt me. For the longest 10 minutes of my life, the man kept the rifle trained on me while I, forced to keep my cool, kept repeating calm phrases, telling him I wasn't going to try anything, that he could lower the gun, that I'd take him wherever he wanted without any trouble. But he didn't waver. His gaze, wild and bloodshot, looked more like a cornered animal's than a human being's. He kept glancing nervously at the mirrors, his body coiled tight like a spring ready to snap. When I asked him in a low voice where he wanted to go, he just said to keep driving. So I did, following that narrow, winding road through the mountains, not seeing another soul, feeling every second pressed down on my chest like time itself was dragging on purpose. I couldn't say how long we drove, until suddenly, my headlights lit up a scene that froze my blood. A man lying in the middle of the road, apparently unconscious or injured, and, tucked back in the forest, almost hidden by the thick vegetation, I spotted the disguised outline of a car. The man next to me went rigid instantly, muttering in a hoarse voice for me not to stop, and he didn't even need to say it. I had already realized it was an obvious trap. I tried to swerve enough to avoid running over the body, keeping the car close to the edge of the road, but as if they knew we'd have to slow down, two men burst out from the trees, running straight at us, one of them opening fire in our direction. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor with everything I had, and tore out of there as fast as the old engine would let me. The man beside me, almost hyperventilating, said those men were after him, that if they caught him, he was a dead man. And at that moment, with brutal clarity, I realized that if they caught both of us, there wouldn't be any survivors. I impulsively suggested calling the police, but his reaction was immediate and threatening. He raised the rifle again and warned me he didn't want the cops involved. That's when, far off in the distance, I spotted a pair of strong headlights coming toward us. They were still a ways off, but from my elevated position on the road, I could see they were closing in fast. In a split-second decision, knowing that staying on the main road would be suicide, I killed the headlights and, in a reckless, or maybe lucky move, veered off onto a narrow, muddy trail winding deep into the woods. The old car, battered and worn out, groaned under the strain. But I didn't hesitate. I shut off the engine and we sat there, swallowed by darkness and silence, hearing nothing but the deafening pounding of our hearts. 3 minutes passed, 3 minutes that felt like hours, before the pursuing car roared past at full speed, never suspecting we were hidden among the trees. From the strength of its lights and the sound of its engine, I realized it was a powerful vehicle. I knew right then that I had made the right call. We stayed hidden a few minutes longer before creeping back onto the road, heading in the opposite direction from where the other car had gone. I didn't turn the headlights back on, driving only by the faint light of the moon and my memory of the road's layout, desperately trying to stay hidden from whoever was out there looking for us that night. For almost an hour, the man sat silently beside me until finally, he rested the rifle on his lap and with a hoarse whisper, thanked me, saying I could drop him off at the next small town. When we got there, he jumped out of the car and disappeared down the deserted streets without looking back. I didn't stop until I found a small roadside motel, where I locked myself in a room and passed out from exhaustion. It wasn't until the next day that I contacted the police. They were extremely cooperative and took the case seriously, questioning me extensively and doing a full investigation. But despite their efforts, they never found the man or any sign of the attackers. About a month ago, I got a call informing me that the case had been officially closed, with no further developments. I never found out who the man I saved was, or what had gotten him into that situation. All I know is, you'll never catch me driving through that part of West Virginia again, even if it means driving around the entire country to avoid it. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're diving into two disturbing stories that took place in the Appalachian Mountains. If you've been following the channel, you know most of our recent videos have focused on this region. But honestly, I can't get enough of it. There's something about the mystery, that surrounds these mountains that just pulls you in. Today, we're looking at two cases that, in my opinion, are absolutely terrifying. The first story follows a group of friends who thought they were ready to take on the dangers of the mountains, only to realize they were completely unprepared for what was waiting for them. In the second story, we follow a man who finds himself at the center of a brutal crime. A crime that, to this day, remains unsolved. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. I haven't been able to reply to everyone, but I do read them all. Thanks for watching. Now, let's get into the video. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. I'm 34 years old, and I've always been a guy with a deep passion for sports. Ever since I was a kid, I played on the school soccer team, and for years, I genuinely believed that was my future. I had talent, I knew that, and it wasn't just something I imagined. There were influential people in the field who showed interest in me, even exploring the possibility of a sports scholarship. But everything changed when I suffered a knee fracture. At the time, it felt like a devastating, nearly irreparable blow, because my entire identity had been built around soccer. I quite literally felt like nothing else in my life had meaning anymore, like the ground had been ripped out from under me. No matter how dedicated I was to physical therapy or how hard I tried to recover, I realized early on that I would never be the same again. For 2 years, I drifted through a state of apathy and deep depression, completely directionless, like I'd lost the compass that guided my life. That's when I met Alicia, a classmate from college who, without even knowing it, ended up giving my life some meaning again. We were never romantically involved, but we formed a deep bond, almost like siblings, a kind of rare and sincere connection. She was the one who introduced me to hiking. Luckily, my knee had healed enough to handle long walks, and little by little, I fell in love with the idea of exploring nature. At first, I always hiked in a group, usually with Alicia's friends, and later, I started going on solo hikes. Still, even though we got along well, I always felt like I didn't really have much in common with the group, and that became even more obvious when Alicia married one of my best friends, and the two of them moved to Illinois. Naturally, I grew distant from the group after that. I still went on a few hikes with Alicia and Mark whenever I visited them in Illinois. Or at least, I used to. Because after what happened, I'm no longer sure I want to set foot on a trail anytime soon. With the original group gone, I started feeling the need to find new companions, to build my own hiking circle. Making new friends after your 20s, at least for me, is a particularly difficult task. No matter how hard I tried, it always felt like the right people just weren't showing up. Then, in 2017, I joined a Facebook group for people who loved hiking, but, for one reason or another, felt more comfortable walking in groups. That decision completely changed my relationship with hiking and gave me a solid, meaningful network of friends. After going on several hikes across different regions of the US, I built friendships that I still hold on to today. The main group I hike with is made up of 4 of us. Jared, a former soldier who was discharged from the military due to an injury. Caleb, a New York City hairstylist who got tired of urban life and started a business supporting hikers. And Mateo, the most versatile of us all, always juggling multiple gigs and never tied down to a single job. Despite our differences, we share core values and a deep love for nature and adventure, which has led us, over the last 2 years, to plan several hiking trips all over the country together. I'm not the kind of person who says everything always goes smoothly or that hiking is some danger-free activity. Far from it. We've encountered some truly weird situations, disturbed people, even near robberies. One time, we woke up to find a stranger inside Mateo's tent. And since he's a notoriously heavy sleeper, he didn't even notice until morning. It was one of the scariest moments of our lives. But as those kinds of experiences happened, we kept learning, adapting our behavior and strategies to always be as prepared as possible. So when we decided to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail, we genuinely felt ready. Or at least we thought we were. It all started in early June of 2023. We got a later start than planned, so we only hiked for about 2 hours before deciding to find a good spot to set up camp. We came across a pretty nice clearing with ideal conditions. It wasn't directly on the trail, but it wasn't completely isolated either. We were close enough to the main path that, if something happened, other hikers could find us easily. We were finishing dinner and sitting around the campfire when a man suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The initial reaction, as you'd expect, was shock. But we quickly realized he wasn't right. His speech was disjointed, his gaze empty and unfocused. And while he looked unkempt and dirty, he didn't seem like a homeless person living in the woods. On the contrary, he looked like someone who had taken care of himself, at least until recently, but had clearly been through something traumatic. We assumed he might be drunk, but there was no smell of alcohol. It was hard to explain. He wasn't threatening, didn't seem dangerous. There were 4 of us, and he was alone. More than anything, he looked like he needed help. We still had phone signal, so it didn't take long for us to call for assistance. That night, none of us got any real sleep. What disturbed us most was how, despite being confused, he kept obsessively repeating the same sentence. He was begging us, almost desperately, to make the whispers in his head stop. He said the whispers had started somewhere deep in the woods and had never left him since. At the time, we assumed it was some kind of mental illness. But later, we started to wonder if he wasn't actually crazy. Maybe he'd been driven to madness by something he'd seen or heard. I'd heard stories before. Folklore. Even unwritten rules tied to the Appalachians. Folktales about entities in the forest. Among those stories, the whispers came up again and again. Some say that in the more remote sections, the golden rule is to never respond to the whispers and to always stick together. I didn't pay much attention to those tales at the time, but that night changed everything. After the man was taken to the hospital, we tried to rest for a bit. And the next morning, we resumed the trail. Over the following 3 days, everything went as planned. The terrain was tough, and sometimes my knee would start to complain. But the pain was more than offset by the sense of inner peace that came with every step. It was like the worries of everyday life faded into the background, as if nature really did have the power to heal the mind. But on the 4th night, everything changed. We had eaten dinner and were already in our tents, when I was suddenly shaken awake by Caleb. I woke up groggy, taking a few seconds to understand what was going on, until a cold chill ran through me. The camp was surrounded by whispers. It felt like we were encircled by an invisible crowd, with faint, almost human voices murmuring non-stop. I asked him what was going on as I reached for the firearm I always carried on my hip. Caleb said he wasn't sure, but Jared wasn't in his tent. He had just vanished. The sound of the whispers had woken him, and when he checked Jared's tent, it was empty. We rushed out of ours and found Mateo already outside, on high alert, gun drawn and pointed at the trees. It was surreal. There were no figures to be seen. But the voices were unmistakable, a constant, low murmur. And we knew, almost instinctively, that we couldn't respond. That was one of the rules. You don't have to believe in folklore. But that night, it was the only logic we had. We had to follow the rules even without understanding them. And above all, we had to stay together. Still, we couldn't just abandon Jared. We set out to find him, never separating, moving as one. We found him sometime later, completely disoriented. The last thing he remembered was hearing a voice calling out to him, like something had compelled him to follow. He told me it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like he was under some kind of control. And coming from him, a man with military training and razor-sharp survival instincts, that scared the hell out of me. The return was unbelievably difficult, for reasons I still can't explain. What should have been a simple 30-minute trek felt like an endless journey. We kept passing the same spots, as if walking in circles, even though we were absolutely sure we weren't. Jared, though back with us, kept asking nonsense questions, forgetting what was going on. Sometimes he seemed himself again, but quickly drifted back into a kind of mental fog. By the time dawn broke, we were desperate, and that's when we spotted another campsite. We knew immediately it wasn't ours, and approaching it had to be done carefully. But thankfully, the people there were kind and welcoming. After we shared our story, they offered help. The most terrifying part, though, was discovering we were almost 200 miles from our original camp. It was physically impossible for us to have covered that distance overnight. And even if it were possible, how do you explain the fact that we spent hours feeling like we were stuck in the same spot? We called for professional assistance, and a team was sent to the location where we had camped. Everything was untouched, like nothing had ever happened. If we had made it back to our camp on our own, maybe we would have convinced ourselves it was all just a collective episode. Something we ate, something in the air, who knows? But the fact that we did something impossible makes it all too real, too unsettling, and it keeps me asking, more and more often, what really lives in those mountains? What was it we heard that night, and why? I don't have answers, but I know that night unlocked a new kind of fear in us. We'd faced dangerous people before, but never the unknown. And lately, I keep thinking about trying to track down the man we helped that first night, trying to find out what he saw, trying to understand what we still can't. What I'm about to tell you happened just 2 weeks ago, and even though I've been through plenty of bad things in my life, I never imagined this experience would turn out to be one of the scariest and most haunting moments I've ever lived through. I had anything but a happy childhood, and to be honest, there was never really room for any real sense of happiness. I grew up in a house where violence was a daily thing, with a father who was brutal, unpredictable, and consumed by a kind of rage that seemed endless. And a mother who, even though her heart was in the right place and she did everything she could, was never really able to stand up to his outbursts. She ended up living constantly caught between fear and despair. Still, the only times my mom ever seemed to find this almost superhuman inner strength was when he threatened to take his anger out on me. Those were the moments she stepped in, even if it cost her. And for that, no matter what, I'll always be grateful to her. That said, my childhood was miserable, filled with constant instability and an almost total lack of affection or safety, which of course took a toll not just on my self-esteem but also on my performance in school. It felt like I was born already carrying an invisible sentence that said I'd never amount to anything good or meaningful in life. When I was 17, my mom passed away. And that loss, besides being absolutely devastating, also became a kind of forced awakening. Maybe because I had nothing left to lose, or maybe because I finally realized I couldn't stay in that environment anymore. So as soon as I turned 18, I built up the courage, stood up to my father, and left that house behind. He could deal with his rage on his own, because even if he gave me his genes, he was never truly my father. Leaving wasn't just a step forward. It was a kind of indescribable relief. It's been 12 years since then, And even though there are still moments when the past feels like an anchor dragging me down, I can honestly say I know who I am now. And little by little, I've been rebuilding what was broken inside me. It's not an easy process, as you can imagine. And sometimes there are setbacks, days when everything feels like it's falling apart again. But in those moments, I think about my mom, about that image of her putting herself between me and my father's fists, and that memory helps me push through the darkest times. So now that that's out of the way, it's important to explain that I never had many opportunities. And when I left home, I ended up living on the streets, which, ironic as it sounds, wasn't even the lowest point of my life. I was lucky enough to cross paths with a volunteer who believed in me for no apparent reason, and who, with incredible generosity, helped me regain my strength, find some direction, and even gave me an old van that, while in desperate need of repairs, gave me a real shot at starting over. A small space that protected me from the cold, the rain. Since then, I've managed to build a more stable life. I found work, and even though the van's not new, with all the repairs I've done over the years, it's become almost an extension of me. Sure, I could afford a new one now, but this van means something deeper than just transportation or a house. It represents hope. It marks the moment a complete stranger took a chance on me, without knowing a thing about me. It reminds me there are still good people out there. Whenever I can take some time off, I like to travel through the mountains. It feels like my safe space, a refuge where I can breathe and be alone with myself. So 2 weeks ago, when I managed to get 14 days off, I decided it was finally time to explore a part of the Appalachian Mountains. I don't even live that far, but I'd never had the chance before, and the thought of wandering through those remote, majestic landscapes genuinely excited me. Traveling through the mountains in an old van isn't easy, but I'm used to it. I know the sounds the van makes, I know its limits, and I was confident everything would go smoothly. The first few days were peaceful, though a few strange things happened. One night, around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound coming from the mountains that felt off. I can't even describe it properly. It was somewhere between a distant wail and a muffled metallic noise. I ended up brushing it off and going back to sleep, convincing myself it was just an animal. But everything changed on the third night. I was in West Virginia, one of the spots I'd most wanted to visit. So when I found a good place to park the van, a dirt back road near a small creek, I didn't hesitate. The plan was to stay 2 or 3 nights and maybe do a few short hikes. But things started going wrong that very first night. I had just finished dinner and was already lying inside the van, everything cleaned up, watching YouTube videos on my phone, when I heard a car pass by. It caught my attention because, along with the sound of the engine, there was this strange, constant whistling noise, like a mechanical issue. Maybe the exhaust or the brakes. What really got to me, though, was how slowly the car was moving. That's unusual in an area like that, where the few people who drive around usually just speed through, since there's no traffic or people, just the occasional animal crossing the road. I ignored the sound and went back to my video, but less than 2 minutes later, I heard the same car again. This time clearly turning onto the dirt road where I was parked. That's when I started to feel a bit uneasy. In urban areas, it's normal to share space with other vans or cars, but out in the woods, where there are so many other places to stop, it's more than a little suspicious for someone to choose the exact same spot. I considered that maybe the person didn't see me parked there, or maybe felt safer near someone else. But honestly, that felt like a lame excuse to avoid facing the growing discomfort I was feeling. Even with the curtains shut, the headlights lit up parts of the van's interior. I waited for them to turn off the engine and lights, but nothing happened. I stayed completely still and quiet as the minutes dragged on. Finally, the headlights went out. I heard one door open and close. Then footsteps. Then another door. And more footsteps. That's when I realized there was more than one person, and they were getting closer to the van. Panic started to creep in. I've had people mess with the van or try the doors before, but always in the city, never somewhere this isolated. One of them turned on a flashlight and tried to look inside, and in that moment, I thought about yelling, about threatening that I had a weapon. But the truth is, I had nothing. And I'd heard too many stories from other people who live in vans saying the best move is to pretend nobody's inside. Then I heard something that froze my blood and made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in years. A sharp pop, a bang, and I realized they were slashing the van's tires. Whatever chance I had of escaping was gone in that instant, and if I still had any doubts about their intentions, those doubts vanished. They were there to hurt someone, and now they knew I couldn't start the van. That's when I heard another vehicle approaching from the distance. The distinct sound of tires crunching over gravel, and in that moment, my fear turned into pure instinct. I heard the men move away from the van, apparently going to meet the new vehicle. I got up, grabbed the knife I always carry with me, and slid into the driver's seat. I opened the door as quietly as possible and stepped out. I was in a position where I couldn't see them, and hopefully, they couldn't see me either. I jumped down a rock ledge and made my way to the creek, hiding in the thick brush. I was almost sure they'd heard me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. And even with the noise of the car and the voices, I felt completely exposed. I crawled away as quietly as I could, but I kept the van in sight. The second car stopped and at least 2 more men got out. 4 total. I watched them move toward the van. 2 had baseball bats, 1 had a knife, and the other held something I couldn't identify. They circled the van, which confirmed they still thought I was inside. A small relief. But it also meant that sooner or later, they'd figure out I wasn't, and might start looking for tracks or searching the area. I kept moving, trying to stay quiet, but not losing pace. When I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering, I started running. I ran like I never had before. I stopped only long enough to catch my breath and kept going. I don't know how many hours passed in that cycle of panic, escape, and exhaustion. I know I spent the whole night out there. The sun was already up, and I still had no idea where I was. Just a knife in my hand, and my phone left behind in the van. I was thirstier than I'd ever been. Extreme stress completely dries out your mouth. It wasn't until around 11 in the morning that I heard a car in the distance and realized I must be near a road. I stayed hidden, afraid those men might still be out looking for me. Or someone else. It was only when I heard the distinct sound of a truck that I finally worked up the courage to step out of the bushes and ask for help. The trucker was surprisingly understanding and told me that something almost identical had happened in that same area about 15 years ago, and that shook me to my core. 15 years? Were these the same people? Or were there other groups out there doing the same kind of twisted thing and getting away with it? The police confirmed that there had been several similar incidents reported in that region over the years. They took me back to the spot where I'd left the van, and the sight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. It was completely trashed, vandalized inside and out, totally unrecognizable. Since then, I've been staying at a coworker's place, and honestly, I think my days of living in a van are over. Maybe it's time to rent a place of my own. To accept that, as much as that life once saved me, it's not safe anymore. And maybe it never really was. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring the stories of 3 people who ventured into the most remote parts of Appalachia, only to come face to face with something truly terrifying in the middle of the night. I don't know about you, but this time of year, when the leaves start turning orange and falling, it's both my favorite season and the scariest time to be wandering around these mountains. Just the thought of being out there alone and suddenly hearing the crunch of footsteps in the leaves behind you. Especially at night. That's nightmare fuel for me. I hope you enjoy this video as much as I did putting it together. And most of all, I hope it keeps you up at night, the same way it did me. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. Earlier this spring, I drove 4 hours into the Appalachians to a lake I've been going to for years. It sits in a narrow hollow, surrounded by ridges so thick with trees that once you drop below the crest, it feels like you're cut off from everything else. Locals call it Black Pine Lake, though most don't talk about it much. Years back, there was some kind of killing there. Details were vague and the papers barely covered it. In truth, I don't even know if the story has any real foundation or if it's just superstition. But the fact is, ever since, people from around the area have kept their distance. Every once in a while you might see tourists who stumble on it while hiking, but they never stay long. The locals won't go near it. For me, though, it became a place I kept coming back to. Quiet water, a strip of grass for a tent, and the pines circling the shore. Peaceful in a way I couldn't find anywhere else. The first day I arrived, the lake was empty like it usually was. I set my tent on a little shelf of sand and grass, stacked my pack, and let the kind of easy peace that comes from being miles from a highway settle over me. I say this because even though I live in a small town, I live right next to a highway, and even if my ears are already used to the noise, getting away from it brings me a kind of peace I can't even explain. By late afternoon, a man and a little girl appeared on the opposite shore. They were pretty far away, but at the time I was using my binoculars, so I could see them clearly. Just to make things clear, I had the binoculars because I've always loved watching birds. Not because I'm some kind of creep. The man had a trucked-in look. Well-worn boots, a camp chair, a cheap cooler, and he put up a small tent not far from the tree line. He looked older than me, closer to 37 or 40, and he looked like the kind of guy who'd been doing weekend trips for a while. The girl was maybe 6, small and held close to him when they moved. Up close, she looked like a normal kid. Scuffed shoes, a crooked ponytail, a jacket, too big for her. But there was something in her face I couldn't place then. Something that made my skin tighten in a way nothing else at the lake ever had. It was as if she moved with a certainty that didn't seem right for a child. And even the man with her didn't treat her like one. I'm telling you this because it's going to be important later. But it's only now that I'm reflecting on that first impression I had. I don't think either of them knew I was watching, which is why they acted without any social filter. That was the first impression I had of them. A feeling that something was off. But as you can imagine, it was just a first impression. And at the time, I didn't think about it the way I'm describing it now. Not long after they had arrived, they made their way over to my side of the lake and introduced themselves. The man was friendly and easy to talk to, clearly interested in the same quiet spots I liked and appreciative of how secluded Black Pine was. The little girl stayed close to him, running around and playing like a normal 6-year-old, collecting stones, climbing on driftwood, laughing at small things. But even as she acted like a child, there were moments when something about her didn't fit. Her gaze could linger in a way that felt almost deliberate, like she was aware of more than she should have been. I told myself children can be curious and strange sometimes, that maybe I was overthinking it. We talked for a while, shared some casual conversation, and by the end of the day they returned to their own campsite. I felt genuinely relieved and happy to have friendly neighbors for the night, the kind that made the woods feel safer without losing the quiet peace I loved about the lake. The next day went pretty much the same way. I'd see them occasionally on the other side of the lake, just two small figures in the distance. At one point, I had wandered a little farther from my campsite, watching a pair of birds, when something made me glance toward their sight. I honestly don't know what it was, but when I looked, my blood ran cold. The girl was in the man's arms, and it looked like they had just kissed. They were a little too intimate for a father and daughter, which made me extremely uncomfortable and made me lower my binoculars. I didn't know if I even wanted to see it, so I started walking back toward my campsite. I just hoped they wouldn't come over to talk that night. I didn't know what to make of it, and I didn't want to feel paranoid, but I also didn't want to pretend everything was fine when something about it unsettled me. After dinner, that image of the two of them was still burned into my mind. I decided I was going to sleep and think about it, or try to forget it, tomorrow. Either way, it would be a decision for the next day. A decision that, as you can probably guess, I never ended up making. That night, I woke to the sound of small, measured steps on the packed earth outside my tent. I sat up and listened, then unzipped a sliver and peeked out. The girl was standing a few yards away at the edge of my firelight, hands at her sides, head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. Her face was turned toward me, the angle of her head, the steady, deliberate smile. Everything about her posture felt rehearsed, maybe intentional. I glanced at my phone. 3:10 in the morning. What the hell was she doing out there? And where was her father? I strained to hear any other sounds. The approach of her father, perhaps. But there was nothing. The forest was quiet, except for the normal noises of nighttime animals. I watched her for a long minute, counting the breaths between heartbeats. Because the adult thing to do is not panic at the sight of a child. But the whole situation was just plain bizarre. She said nothing as I watched her. She just stood there, watching me watch her. When the trance of my own panic finally eased enough for me to move, I unzipped my tent and stepped out. Her face lit up the way a child's does when they see someone they want to play with. She held out a small hand, as if to take mine. I know how that looks on paper. A grown man afraid of a 6-year-old. But fear isn't about reason. It's a body's shorthand when something registers wrong. I told myself I couldn't leave a child wandering alone in the woods at 3 in the morning. I asked her if her father was with her, and she just shook her head. Then I asked if she wanted me to walk her back to their campsite, and she lifted her hand toward me again, this time with a faint, almost mischievous smile on her lips. The last thing I wanted was to take her hand. I felt like a trapped animal, aware that something was wrong. But she was just a child, and I didn't want my panic to show. So, I slipped my hand into hers, Her fingers were small and shockingly strong, the kind of grip that shouldn't be there on such a small hand. We walked in single file through scrub and underbrush. The girl didn't speak. She padded ahead with a practiced, steady pace, and when I tried to ask anything, where her campsite was, whether her father was awake, her expression flickered and hardened in a way that made my throat close. She tilted her head and asked me why I was talking to her like she was a child. It was a single thought that detonated inside my chest. I had assumed she was a child because that's what she looked like. I realized I could not remember ever hearing her called daughter or kid, or any sign that they were related. The man had spoken to me, yes, but the casual details I'd filled in my head, father and daughter, weren't solid. I asked her what she meant by that, and if she wasn't supposed to be camping with her father. She just smiled again and said that I was about to find out. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw him. I don't know how long he had been standing there, just a few feet away from us, staring in our direction with a knife in his hand. Not a hunting knife for fish, or a camper's folding tool. It was a blade held in the way someone holds it when they plan where it will go. Everything in my body told me to pull my hand back, to run, to do anything but stand there. When I tried to step away, the girl's fingers tightened around mine as if she was hooked to me. Her grip was far stronger than it should have been for a small hand. It took both of my hands to wrench free. Then I just ran as fast as I could, without looking back. I think what saved me wasn't exactly speed, but endurance. I've run several marathons in my life, and because of that, even though they initially chased me, at some point I lost them. They must have stopped to catch their breath. I don't know whether they turned back or simply gave up because my distance became too great. When dawn cracked clean over the ridges, I stopped and oriented myself by the way the light fell, and, exhausted, made my way to a faint trail I recognized. I wasn't on the trail that led back to their campsite, and thank God for that. I just wanted to get back to my car, which I finally did by the end of that day. I drove into the nearest town and sat in the police station for a long time. I described the camp location, pointed out the ridge and the fallen pine I used as a landmark, and told them about the man and the girl. They took my statement and said they would check the area. A few days later, a detective called to say they had searched the hollow and found nothing. No tent and no tracks. By this point, I knew perfectly well that they didn't believe my story. Those two had erased any evidence that I, or they, had ever been there. I still go hiking in the Appalachians. I still find other lakes and other hollowed-out places to sleep under the stars. But I haven't been back to Black Pine Lake. The valley that once felt like an honest refuge now keeps its distance in my head. The thing that unsettles me most isn't the missing gear or the knife or the way those two moved together in the dark. It's that when I think back to her face, the smile was not childish or malicious in any straightforward way. It was precise. It was practiced. It was a look someone older would use when they were certain of what they were about to do. But if she was really an adult, why had she pretended to be a child on that first night? It probably had all been a trick to lure me in. I'm no good at introductions, so I'll just get straight to the point about what happened to me 7 years ago. I was in West Virginia, spending several days backpacking through the woods. I was already about 20 miles from the nearest road, and for the first 2 days, I hadn't seen another person. It was mid-fall, so the air bit at my hands more than in summer, but I had the right gear, and I was fine with the cold. I've always preferred hiking this time of year, mostly because my favorite sound since I was a kid has been the crunch of leaves underfoot. Don't ask me why. I can't explain it. I just love it. That's the main reason most of my hikes end up happening in the fall, when the ground is covered in dry leaves and every step makes that sound I never get tired of. That particular morning, I made a quick coffee on my pocket stove and headed for the next site, 12 miles away, which in this part of the US is a proper day's hike for someone with experience. 5 hours into it, I heard footsteps ahead on the trail. I looked up, and a man was coming toward me, heading the opposite way. I hadn't expected to see anyone, so I nodded and kept walking. He looked as surprised as I was. At least a look crossed his face I couldn't read as soon as he saw me. He didn't smile back, and I think that little detail made me notice he didn't have anything with him. It's rare to see someone literally in the middle of nowhere, wearing only the clothes on their back. But I ended up ignoring it because it was likely he was camping nearby and had just gone for a walk, so I didn't think more of it. I didn't even find it odd that he hadn't smiled. You'd be surprised how many sketchy people I've run into on the trails over the years. This was just another one. So I kept going toward the area where I intended to camp. I'd never been there before, but at the time, I was part of a Facebook group that shared tips about hikes. One of the guys in the group had said there was a great spot to camp there. I'll admit I was disappointed when I arrived. The guy had said not only was it great for pitching a tent, it had an incredible view. The tent part was true. The ground there was soft and flat, but the view was nowhere to be seen. I thought maybe I'd gone to the wrong spot, even though I'd followed all the directions. Anyway, I was tired and not up for searching for another site. This one was as good as any. I set up the tent, made dinner, and sat there watching the stars. At some point I must have dozed off, because I woke up with a numb hand from a weird sleeping position and no sense of time. That's when I saw it was only 11 p.m., but I was tired, so it was time to turn in. One thing I always do before going to bed is pee. I hate waking up in the middle of the night needing to go, so I never go to bed without taking a leak. Even when I don't really have to, there's always a little something. I stepped away a bit, into the trees. It's annoying to do it where other people will set up tents. If you've ever gone hiking like I do and stayed in spots where people usually camp, then you probably know that smell in the morning. The awful stench of dried piss. I can't stand people who do that, so I wasn't about to add to it. Instead, I walked off toward the trees, into an area where setting up a campsite would have been impossible. That's when, in the middle of peeing, I heard footsteps. Instinctively, I hid behind a tree. Not a minute later, I saw the man appear. It was the same man I'd seen about 4 hours earlier, walking the opposite way. Obviously, that was an alarm bell. Again, he had nothing on him. Had he followed me here? But how? Had he tracked my footprints like some kind of tracker? I stayed hidden while I watched him walk over to my tent and peek inside. The tent was open except for the bug netting, which was closed. He was clearly looking for me. I swear my first thought was that maybe he needed something, and being the only person out there, he'd turned back to check. Maybe he was lost. But then I saw him walk toward the trees on the side opposite where I was, and hide behind a bush. I could see part of his body, but there was no doubt he was crouched there, waiting. That's when I realized he must have had other intentions. He was waiting for me to come back to the campsite, maybe to catch me off guard. I stayed there for hours, hiding behind the tree and only partially able to see parts of him. I had nothing on me. Everything was inside the tent, except for a small flashlight. I didn't even have my phone. I thought about confronting him, but I didn't know if he had a weapon or what he intended to do. At some point I lost sight of him, and that's when I got truly terrified. The ground was thick with dry leaves, so if he'd moved, I would have heard it. But at the same time, I couldn't see him where he had been. I shrank back behind the tree again, and for what felt like too long, I just listened. Convinced that any second he'd find me and I'd have to fight for my life. But nothing. Morning came, and there was no sign of the man anywhere. I ran to the campsite, grabbed the first aid kit and my phone, and bolted through the woods. I didn't know if he was still out there watching me, so I ran as if he was. I only stopped running when I felt far enough and safe enough to breathe and think about what to do next. I didn't want to go back, so I just kept going until I found the next trail and could ask for help. But the truth is, when I finally reached the road and got a ride from a guy passing by, I didn't have the courage to tell anyone else what had happened except him. After hearing my story, he just asked if I wasn't exaggerating a bit and laughed in my face. That's when I realized how stupid I'd sound to someone who hadn't been there that night. So I never reported it to the police. They probably would have laughed at me too, and nothing would have come of it. But I know what I lived through, and I know that man was hiding there waiting for me. I don't know what he wanted, but I know I reacted the way I needed to. I've lived alone with my dad since I was a baby. My mom died not long after giving birth to me, so it's always just been the two of us. My grandparents were never around. My dad's relationship with them is terrible, so he's the only family I've ever had. When I was a kid, it wasn't always easy for us to connect, but by the time I hit my teenage years, something changed. I can't say exactly what it was, but we started getting closer, doing things together. One of those things was hiking and camping in the woods. We live really close to the Smoky Mountains, so once I was old enough to handle it, we started taking trips out there. This story happened 8 years ago, when I was 16. Even though I was still young, I'd grown up fast. I was tall, broad-shouldered, and people often thought I was at least 25, when really I was just a teenager. I mention this because I'm convinced the way I looked played a part in how things unfolded. It was late September, and that section of the Smokies, already one of the less popular areas, was basically deserted that time of year. At the start of the trail, we crossed paths with a friendly couple, but after that, we didn't see another soul. By the time we reached the unmarked part of the woods, it felt like we were completely alone. The plan was to hike out to a waterfall we'd visited once before, camp there for a couple of nights, and then head back. Depending on our pace, the whole trip would take about a week. The first night went fine, and the mood between us was good. At least, I thought so. Until the next morning when my dad casually asked if I'd gotten up or heard anything during the night. I hadn't. I'd slept straight through. I've always been a heavy sleeper, even out in the middle of the forest. He knew that, so I guess that's why he didn't push the subject. We packed up camp and kept moving toward the second site. Without a defined trail, it was slower going, and sometimes we had to reroute around thick brush or fallen trees. Still, we made steady progress and finally reached our spot around 7 p.m. It wasn't the same place we'd camped at the year before, but honestly, it was better. The trees gave more cover, and the ground was flat enough for the tent. It felt secure. But around 9 p.m., we heard it for the first time. A woman scream. We froze. I'll never forget the way my dad looked at me in that moment, wide-eyed, like his mind was racing just as fast as mine. It didn't make sense. We were supposed to be alone out there. And if we weren't, why would anyone be screaming like that in the middle of nowhere? We strained to figure out the direction it had come from, but it was too vague. Pitch black woods, an unfamiliar area. It wasn't exactly the safest idea to just wander blindly toward it. Still, we couldn't ignore it either. We got up, walked a little ways from camp, just enough so that if she screamed again, we'd have a better sense of where it was coming from. Minutes later, another scream. Louder this time. Sharper. My dad turned to me and told me to stay behind at camp. I knew better than to argue when he got like that. Firm. Unmoving. But I was stubborn too, and there was no way I was letting him go alone. I nodded like I was going to listen, then waited until he was far enough ahead before following quietly. I wasn't trying to be reckless. I was just 16, caught somewhere between wanting to prove myself and refusing to feel like a kid. We walked for what felt like forever, every step crunching against the silence of the woods. My pulse was pounding, and I could feel the cool night air sticking to my skin, heavy with the damp smell of leaves. Every time a branch snapped under my boot, I flinched, certain the sound would give me away. Finally, through the trees, the shape of a cabin appeared. From where I hung back, half hidden behind the trunks, I could barely make it out. It looked old, half collapsed in places, like nobody had lived there in years. My dad didn't try to go inside. He just called out from the doorway, his voice steady but cautious. That's when she screamed again. And then, almost instantly, a man appeared in the doorway. He was holding what looked like a metal pipe in his hands. I saw my dad hesitate, take one small step back. That was all the man needed to feel like he had the upper hand. He moved forward, slow at first, then faster, raising the pipe slightly. I don't know what came over me. I spotted a thick branch on the ground and grabbed it. Heart racing, I ran straight out of the trees toward my dad. I must have looked bigger than I realized. 16, but tall, broad, wearing a black hoodie, gripping that branch like a weapon. The man froze, then spun on his heel and bolted into the trees. Only then did it hit me how dangerous the whole thing had been. If he'd had a gun, or if there had been more than one of them, it could have ended badly, really badly. My dad looked at me in a way that scared me. I thought he was about to start yelling, maybe even ground me until I moved out. But then his expression softened. He put his hand on my shoulder and simply thanked me. He looked tired. He looked old. I think he realized that if I hadn't shown up, things would have gone really bad. Inside the cabin, we found a woman, tied up against what looked like the frame of an old fireplace. She was terrified, shaking, clearly with no idea how she'd even ended up there. We stayed in the cabin with her until help arrived. At least there. We had some shelter if the man decided to come back. All through the night we heard noises outside. Twigs snapping. Movement in the brush. Every time, I thought for sure he was back. Maybe armed this time. But morning came, and with it, rescue. A helicopter flew the woman to the hospital while we were escorted out of the Smokies. We never went back to that part of the mountains again. As far as I know, the man was never caught. I don't know what became of the woman either. My dad and I still hike sometimes, but it's different now. That feeling we used to have, that bad things only happen to other people, disappeared for good that night. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 3 terrifying stories that all happened in Appalachia during the month of October. From a group of friends who set out to explore a ghost town searching for the supernatural, only to find something far more terrifying. To a hiker who realizes he's being stalked, and finally, a man who tries to commit an unthinkable crime in broad daylight. These stories are a stark reminder that there are truly dangerous people out there in these woods, and that sometimes the real horror isn't hiding in the shadows, it's walking right beside us. Thank you so much for being here and for choosing to support this channel. I truly hope you enjoy this video as much as I enjoyed reading and putting these stories together. If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. Before I start telling you what happened at the beginning of this October, I just need to give you a little bit of context about me and what led up to it. Being as honest as possible, I'm part of a friend group that's probably the dumbest bunch you could imagine. I know I shouldn't talk about them like that, but it's the truth. Lately, I've been trying to distance myself and make new friends. Growing up, I was always a skinny, scrawny kid. That alone made me the target of jokes everywhere I went. On top of that, I got straight A's in everything. And we all know jealousy is a major reason people bully others. But despite all that, more than anything, I just wanted to fit in, to have friends, to find my tribe. I couldn't do it being who I was. So over the years, I started adapting myself to be exactly what people wanted me to be. If the group was dumb, I was dumb too. If they drank, I drank. I kind of regret being like that. Having 100 different faces depending on who I'm around. But honestly, at this point, it's really hard to stop being that guy who just can't say no because he doesn't want to look lame. When I finally got to college, I met this guy I actually liked, personality-wise, which is rare for me. He's smart, and in a lot of ways, we're pretty similar. Since day one, we've gotten along well. The only big difference between us is that he believes in all the supernatural stuff that I think is total nonsense. Over the years, our friendship grew, and even though he knows I don't buy into any of that, He keeps trying to drag me into ghost hunts, weird rituals, and all kinds of supernatural crap. At the beginning of September, he started talking about exploring a ghost town in the Appalachians called Elkmont. He had a group of guys from high school who were also into that stuff, and I'm pretty sure one of them was the one feeding him all these stories. He wanted me to meet them and go explore the place with them. Like I said, there are two important things about me. I don't believe in the supernatural. I always say things are only supernatural until someone figures out the natural explanation. And I have a hard time saying no to people. So I agreed to go with them to Elkmont. Plus, ever since I hit my late teens and started building some muscle and stamina, hiking had become one of my favorite things to do. I'd never hiked the Appalachian Trail before, so honestly, I was kind of excited about the invite. If I could just stay out of the ghost hunting nonsense, maybe it could even be fun. The day finally came, and there were 4 of us total. Obviously, I'm not using anyone's real name here, but everything I'm about to tell you is absolutely true. We left around 5 in the morning and drove about 4 hours to the start of the trail. The group wasn't as bad as I expected. A bit childish, sure, but mostly just excited and maybe a little nervous about the whole thing. One really important detail: the dumbest decision I've ever made in my life was agreeing to leave our phones behind. We had 1 video camera and a bunch of weird devices with names I can't even remember, apparently used to detect paranormal activity. Honestly, there's no excuse for it. I still don't know what went through our heads when we all agreed to that. Anyway, we left our phones in the car and started hiking toward Elkmont. The first 2 days went great. We camped in some beautiful spots and even met 2 other hikers who were doing a different part of the trail. They didn't join us, but they were cool. It wasn't until the 3rd day, when we finally got to Elkmont, that things started going wrong. My friend was both excited and scared to be there. He genuinely believes in that stuff, so for him, it was a mix of emotions. I, on the other hand, was just straight up uneasy. It's bizarre to see houses still standing like that, perfectly intact, but completely abandoned. Or at least, that's what we thought. Since we got there before sunset, we decided to walk around and check out some of the houses while we still had daylight, just to get a sense of the place before night came. According to them, the real investigations would start after midnight. After exploring for a bit and setting up a few cameras to record overnight, we went back to set up our tents. That's when I first felt like we were being watched. It wasn't a strong, undeniable feeling, just a subtle one, so I didn't say anything until one of the guys, let's call him Michael, came back from taking a leak and claimed he had his first piece of paranormal evidence. He swore someone was watching him from inside one of the houses. The thing is, he thought it was a ghost. I was sure it was a person. I told them I'd been feeling uncomfortable since we arrived, like someone was around us. Of course, they took that as more proof of the supernatural instead of considering that we might actually be in danger from a real person. The only thing that kept me somewhat calm was that we hadn't seen any sign that whoever was in there was violent or meant us harm. It could have just been someone seeking shelter, maybe another hiker who decided to stay in one of the houses. Still, it was unsettling, and I suggested we head back. No one wanted to, and I didn't want to go alone, so we stayed. During dinner, they kept hyping each other up, talking about their gadgets, cryptids, and a bunch of Appalachian legends that I honestly tuned out. My focus was on scanning the dark windows of the houses around us, trying to spot any movement or sign that we weren't alone. Finally, around midnight, they decided it was time to start exploring again. I wanted to stay back by the tents, but I wasn't sure what was worse, being alone or going with them. We checked the first house together, and obviously, there was no sign of ghosts or anything supernatural. Just plenty of evidence that people had been there before us. Then Michael said we should split up to cover more ground. Hell no. I wasn't going to explore any house alone, so I said I'd head back to camp. I went back near the fire pit and watched them disappear in different directions with their cameras and equipment. I don't know how much time passed before I heard a scream coming from one of the houses further away. For a second, I thought about staying put, but I couldn't just ignore it if someone was in trouble. I grabbed my gun and headed toward the house. I didn't know where the others were, or why none of them had reacted to the scream. Maybe they hadn't heard it. The door was already partly broken when I pushed it open and stepped inside. It was almost pitch dark. I called out for Mark, but there was no answer. I moved from room to room, gun in hand. Somewhere ahead, I heard a door slam. I called again. Maybe he wasn't hurt and was just trying to mess with me. He was definitely the dumbest one of the group. Then I heard another door. This time opening, not closing. I thought seriously about turning back. I was terrified at that point. But then I saw Mark. He was slumped against a wall, half sitting, half lying down, clearly unconscious. I ran over and tried to wake him up. And that's when I saw the mark on his head. Someone had hit him with something. I cursed myself for agreeing to leave my phone in the car and tried to get him to wake up. But he wouldn't, and I couldn't drag him out on my own. I retraced my steps through the house, shouting for the others. That's when my friend came running, completely panicked, saying he couldn't find Spencer anywhere. He had searched the house he was in, called his name a bunch of times, and got nothing. When I told him someone was there with us and had attacked Mark, I could literally see the color drain from his face. We both ran back inside, dragged Mark out together, and laid him on the ground. He started to wake up a bit, still super confused and weak. We sat there for a while trying to get him stable enough to move back to camp, where we had a first aid kit to stop the bleeding. We kept calling for Spencer, but there was no sign of him. By that point, we were all in full panic mode. The only logical explanation was that Spencer had been attacked too. We didn't want to split up. Clearly someone out there wanted to hurt us, but we couldn't just leave him behind either. We decided to take Mark back first, then go look for Spencer together. But when we got to the camp, everything was trashed. The tents were ripped apart, gear scattered everywhere. We hid inside one of the houses and barricaded ourselves in the bathroom until morning. All night we could hear noises, footsteps, doors opening and closing, like someone was searching for us. We knew it wasn't safe to move at night. Finally, the sun came up. Mark had regained some strength, so we went back to the camp to see what we could salvage. That's when we found Spencer. He was lying on the ground, covered in cuts and bruises. Whoever attacked Mark had attacked him too. We needed to get out of there fast. We helped him up, grabbed whatever gear we could still use, and started walking. Thankfully, about 10 minutes later, we ran into two hikers we'd met earlier. They weren't idiots like us. they actually had a satellite phone. An hour later, help arrived. Mark and Spencer were taken to the hospital, and most of our stuff was recovered, except for the gear we'd left inside the houses. To this day, none of that has been found, and there are still no leads on who attacked us out there. All I know is that no matter what happened, I'll never be that stupid and naive again. The truth is, we put ourselves in that situation, and things could have ended a whole lot worse. Everything started about a month ago, but it wasn't until this week that I truly understood how serious it was. And honestly, I have no idea what's going to happen next. I'm from a small town in the Appalachians called Hindman, in Kentucky. I live on the edge of town, where there aren't many houses around. Because of that, the woods behind my place have always felt like they were part of my home. I've never exactly been afraid of the forest, just respectful. I've always respected the land. When I was a kid, my mom used to take me hiking all the time. She was outdoorsy as hell, and the forest was clearly her happiest place. About 2 years ago, she died. I was angry for a long time. She was too young, and she didn't deserve what happened to her. After that, I stopped going camping and climbing. I spent most of my time locked inside the house. A few months ago, I finally started to feel like I was healing. I was processing the grief better. And about a month ago, I decided to step back into the forest. At first, it was small and manageable. I spent just one night out there close to home, a test run. I knew the area so well it felt safe. It was incredible. I'm not gonna lie and say I didn't cry, because I did. But it felt like exactly what I needed. To leave all that pain behind, right there in the woods where my mom had always been happiest, and finally move on. It might sound strange to some people, but it worked. I came back home feeling hopeful, like I could finally breathe again. That's when I decided that the following weekend, I'd go out for real again. This time, deeper into the remote areas, like I used to. 3 nights away, then back home. All week I was restless, counting down the days until I could leave. When the weekend finally came, I headed out at dawn. The plan was to spend the first and second nights in places I already knew well. On the third night, I'd leave the main trail and hike further south into an area I'd never been before. The first 2 days were peaceful. I wasn't in the shape I used to be, so I reached both campsites later than I'd planned, but everything went smoothly. The first night, there was a friendly family camping nearby. They had 2 small kids and a couple of dogs that ran right up to me. The second night, there was no one at the campsite when I arrived. But sometime in the middle of the night, I heard someone set up a tent near mine. That moment is always uncomfortable. Hearing someone moving around out in the dark when you can't see what they're doing. But nothing happened. In the morning, the guy was already outside cooking breakfast. He greeted me, apologized for the noise, and we made some small talk about the weather, nearby trails, and places we'd hiked before. What neither of us mentioned, and what I definitely noticed, is where we were heading next. That's a basic rule when camping. You don't tell strangers your plans. He seemed like a decent guy, but we didn't know each other, and I take safety seriously in these mountains. Around 9 a.m., we said goodbye, and I moved on. I hiked for about 3 hours before leaving the trail. From there, I had another 3 hours to reach the spot where I planned to set up camp. But when I got there, it was a mess. It had rained 2 days before, and the ground was pure mud. I didn't even feel safe stepping on some parts. It looked like I could sink in deep. There was no one around to call for help if something happened. I made a mental note to warn people in the Facebook camping group later that this wasn't a good spot after bad weather. Some guy in that group had recommended the area, but I figured he'd been there in better conditions. The sun was starting to set, and I needed a campsite, fast. The last thing I wanted was to wander around in the dark. Luckily, I found a spot. Not great, but better. I started setting up my tent right away. By the time I finished, it was pitch black. I planned to sleep early and get up at sunrise, but I was starving and getting cold. I decided to build a small fire, heat up some food, and lift my spirits. I walked around the campsite looking for wood. By then, it was pitch dark, and my flashlight barely cut through the night. About 5 minutes in, I felt movement to my right. Instinctively, I turned off the flashlight, standing there in total darkness. Moonlight barely slipped through the trees. That's when I heard a man's voice, clear and close. He said there was no point in turning off the light because he could still see me. The way he said it, the calm, steady tone, froze me to the core. I turned the flashlight back on and pointed it where the voice came from, but there was no one here. I told him to step out, but got no response. I asked what he wanted. Silence again. At this point, I started to feel the hand holding the flashlight tremble slightly. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened this night vision app I'd downloaded. I'd never really trusted it, but someone in the Facebook group had sworn it worked. As calmly as I could, I raised my phone and aimed the camera into the darkness of the forest. That's when I saw it, a shadow, standing right in front of me. I froze. After a few seconds, I forced the words out, telling him I was armed. He didn't move. He just stood there for a long moment, then simply started walking in the opposite direction. I was frozen, but slightly relieved that mentioning the gun made him back off. The last thing I wanted was to wander through the woods at night, so I went back to the tent and locked myself inside. There didn't seem to be anything out there. No footsteps, no voices, just the usual sounds of the forest at night. And honestly, that kind of silence is worse than noise. The anticipation messes with your head. Knowing someone's out there but not knowing what they want. It eats at you. Even if you're armed and ready, that feeling still hits you, tight in your chest, like you can't breathe right. I thought about the guy from the previous night, but the voice didn't sound anything like his. When the sun came up, I didn't waste a second. I started shoving everything into my pack as fast as I could. I just wanted out. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about the trail. I just wanted to get the hell away from that place. But right as I threw the backpack over my shoulders, I saw him. He was there, half hidden behind the trees, like he'd been standing there the whole time, just watching me. For a second, my stomach dropped. I told him again that I was armed and not to come any closer. I didn't wait to see what he'd do. I just left. By the time I reached my car, it was already past 4 in the morning. And that's when I noticed that my phone was gone. I went through every pocket, dumped everything out of my pack. Nothing. It was like it had just disappeared. The phone was the only thing missing, and I told myself I must have dropped it somewhere on the trail. A week later, I got home from running a few errands and saw this small box sitting on my doorstep. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably a package I'd ordered and forgotten about. But the second I picked it up, I knew it wasn't. There were no labels, no shipping stickers. I took it inside and opened it. For a few seconds, I just stared at what was inside the box, my mind completely blank. I couldn't process it, couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was my phone. I rushed to the window and scanned the street, expecting to see someone watching. But there was no one. At least, no one I could see. The phone had been completely wiped. Every photo, every app, every login, gone. And I still can't figure out how they got in. It was locked with a passcode. I went straight to the police. But if it had happened now, I wouldn't have even bothered. They said they'd look into it, but basically told me there wasn't much they could do. The man hadn't been violent, and he'd returned my property. The officer even said it with a smirk, like it was a joke, like it wasn't serious, like it didn't matter that whoever had stalked me in the forest now knew exactly where I lived. It's been 2 days since then. Nothing's happened. No strange cars, no figures outside my house. But I can't shake the feeling this isn't over. And the worst part is, I don't think the police will do a damn thing when it starts again. I never liked to think of myself as paranoid. But over time, I've learned that being alone in nature, truly alone, is a privilege that fear steals from women. That's why I started using what I call the decoy tent. 2 tents, even when it's just me. The idea is simple. From a distance, it looks like there's more than one person, maybe a couple, maybe even 2 pairs. Ever since I started doing this, the difference has been huge. Fewer lingering stares, fewer invasive questions. I felt safer, and in a way, more invisible. That fall, I planned a 4-day hike along a section of the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania. The trip was supposed to be with a friend, but she got sick at the last minute. I thought about canceling, but I'd already taken the days off. And that pull, that feeling of freedom, was too strong to ignore. I'd done dozens of solo hikes before. This was supposed to be just another one. From day 1, though, things went wrong. The trail was crowded, and the camping area I'd planned to use was packed too. I should have felt safe. I wasn't in a remote area. There were people all around if I needed help. Still, I didn't feel safe, which was strange. Like I said, I've got experience. I've been in far more isolated places, even overnight. But that day, something just felt off, like a quiet, creeping unease. When I got to the campsite at the end of the first day, I counted 7 other tents besides mine. It was an open spot, safe, fairly close to the main trail. I went through my little ritual. The main tent and the decoy tent, always the same distance apart, facing opposite directions. From the outside, I looked like part of a small group. Around 7 in the evening, As the sun was going down, a man walked over. He was camped on the opposite side, and I'd already noticed him earlier on the trail, watching me. He asked if I had a can opener. I said no, with a quick smile. He lingered for a few seconds, like he was trying to find an excuse to keep talking. Then, he asked if I was alone. That question, so casual, so ordinary, can be like a hidden blade in some situations. I learned early on how to pick up on the real intent behind questions that sound harmless at first. There's a subtle difference between curiosity and motive, and my instincts reacted before my brain did. I said no, that I had friends coming later. He smiled, gave me a look I couldn't quite read, and walked off. The rest of the evening dragged by in uneasy silence. I could feel his eyes on me every time I moved. I even did something I almost never do. I tried chatting a bit with a family camped farther away, just to reinforce the illusion that I wasn't by myself, that there were people nearby if I needed them. I thought about packing up and finding another spot, but that would have meant hiking in the dark and setting up camp somewhere isolated. Caution beat fear, and I decided to stay. The night was long. One of the downsides of camping near others is the noise. People who can't sleep. People showing up late to set up their tents. People getting up to pee in the middle of the night. It's a mix of sounds that can either annoy you or comfort you, depending on the kind of person you are. Normally, I'd find it annoying, but that night I was grateful for it. Grateful not to be completely alone. Even though I slept terribly, I woke up before dawn. The air was cold and damp, and the whole camp was quiet. I looked around. Almost all the other tents were still zipped shut. I started packing up, just wanting to hit the trail and leave that place behind. That's when I heard something coming from my decoy tent. Something between a movement and a breath. I figured it was an animal, maybe a raccoon digging for food. I could never have guessed what was actually happening. I walked closer, unzipped the flap, and froze. Inside, completely naked, was the man from the night before. Lying there like that space belonged to him. Had he slept there, just a few feet from me, with only a thin layer of fabric between us? Before I could react, he opened his eyes, grabbed me hard, and pulled me inside. Panic took over my body. I screamed. A sound I didn't even recognize as my own. Everything happened too fast. Footsteps, voices, people running. Someone pulled him off me. Others held him down. He was shouting something, accusing me of inviting him, saying I was lying. But everyone knew. They'd seen his looks the day before. My discomfort. The tension hanging in the air. Of course, the police were called. They took him away, and for a while, I thought the nightmare was over, that justice would be done. But I should have known better. The next day, I found out he'd been released. They said there wasn't enough evidence, even though other campers had seen everything. Since then, I can't stop thinking about that tent. The image of him lying there, waiting. It seeps into my dreams. What haunts me isn't just what happened, but what could have happened if I'd truly been alone. If there hadn't been other people in that campground. What terrifies me most is his confidence. The confidence to do something like that in a place full of others. It terrifies me to think he's still out there. And it terrifies me even more, knowing that someone who does something like that once will do it again. And probably worse. It makes me sick just to think about it. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 3 stories of people who were inside their own homes. The one place where we're supposed to feel safe, yet ended up living through absolutely traumatic experiences. If you've been around the channel for a while, you've probably heard me say that these are some of my favorite kinds of stories. For me, there's nothing scarier than the contrast between the safety of your own home and something, or someone, invading it. And if it all happens in the middle of a storm, even better. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. There are traumatic moments that have the ability to distort our sense of time. And this was one of them for me. This happened a little over 3 years ago, but many times it feels like it was only yesterday. At the time, I lived alone in a 1-story ranch house at the edge of a quiet, rural town in West Virginia. It was the kind of place with long stretches of empty fields between houses and a single road in or out. If you've ever heard of this part of the country, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. There are areas that aren't just a little isolated. They're genuinely forgotten in the middle of nowhere. The house itself was small and plain, but it was mine, and since I had bought it with my own money, I loved it. 2 bedrooms, a narrow hallway that led to the kitchen and living room, and a crawl space under the floor that I never really used. The best part of the house for me was the backyard, which pointed directly at the forest. It was early autumn and the nights were starting to get cold. In fact, on this particular night it was raining heavily outside, and I loved that. I was comfortable and warm inside the house listening to the rainfall. That evening had been uneventful. I'd made dinner, done some work on my laptop, and then just drifted into scrolling on my phone. By around 10, the entire place was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge and the rain outside. Outside, it was pitch black. No streetlights out there, just a thin moon. After dark, no one goes out in this area, and because of that, if you look outside, the feeling of isolation is even stronger. One thing that's important to say is that even though we live in a small community where we all know each other and trust one another, everyone locks their windows and doors after dark. There are countless myths about creatures from the forest that can enter your home if you don't lock your doors. Not that I believed in those things, but just the act of locking everything gave me a sense of security. So by this time, I had already locked the doors and windows. I remember glancing at the time, 10:42 p.m., the time I usually went to bed. I had just closed my eyes when I heard it. A dull, slow scrape along the siding of the house. Not like wind, not like an animal. A long, deliberate drag of something hard against the outer wall. I held my breath and waited, but it stopped as suddenly as it had started. The rain continued to fall heavily. After a minute of silence, I told myself it had to be a tree branch, or maybe some animal brushing by. Potentially some animal trying to protect itself from the rain. So I rolled over, trying to ignore it. Maybe 10 minutes passed before I heard a faint metallic sound from the kitchen. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. The subtle shift of a lock or a handle. This could no longer be an animal, so my heart started pounding, and I sat up, straining to listen. Another soft noise followed, like someone stepping carefully across the tile floor. I couldn't ignore it. No one had ever entered my house before, but I had no doubt someone had come in. I wasn't alone anymore. I slipped out of bed, bare feet, and crept to the bedroom door. My house had no creaky floors, but even then, I moved as lightly as possible. Probably something we all do instinctively. Then I leaned out into the hallway. It was completely dark except for the faint glow of the router in the living room. I stayed there for what felt like forever. The only sound was the rain outside and my own heartbeat. Then, from the far end of the hall, near the kitchen, came a slow, deliberate breath. This was really happening. Someone was inside my house. My brain was processing this information without truly processing it. I shut my bedroom door as quietly as I could, locked it, and backed toward the window. My phone was still on the nightstand. I grabbed it and immediately dialed 911. Then I crouched down, listening. I knew I was in a part of the country where the police probably never got called or where it would take forever for them to arrive. Still, I said what I needed to say, and on the other end, they told me a police car was already on its way. They'd take 37 minutes to get there. It was too long. I was going to have to deal with this on my own. The sound of steps began moving down the hallway. Slow, careful, like whoever it was knew I was there. They had probably heard me talking. They reached the door of my bedroom and stopped right in front of it. Then a faint sound of fingers brushing against the door frame. Whoever was on the other side was taking their time. They knew the police would take a while to get there, and so they could take as long as they wanted. But I was terrified of running into the woods. Years earlier, something had happened to me out there at night, and just the thought of fleeing in that direction made my stomach knot. Now, I had to choose between running into the forest and whatever lived there, or staying and facing whoever was on the other side of the door. That's when a third option came to me. The roof of my house sat relatively low compared to the window. I could throw something out the window to make it look like I'd run that way, then climb out and hide on the roof. I just had to make as little noise as possible. My one advantage was the rain. It was coming down in sheets at that hour, and maybe the noise would cover the sound of me moving across the shingles. On top of that, I'd always been small and light. Maybe that would help too. So that's what I did. While the person on the other side of the door was clearly trying to open it, I grabbed one of my jackets and threw it out the window. Then, holding on with more strength than I thought I had, I pulled myself up onto the roof of my house. The relief of not falling was enormous. I just lay flat on the shingles, the rain drenching me completely as my heart pounded 1,000 beats per minute from the adrenaline. I didn't know if whoever had entered would find me there. I had no way of moving without making noise, so I just stayed there until in the distance I heard the police car. It was a big scene. All the neighbors peeking through their windows. Some braver and closer ones coming over to me and asking what had happened. I could barely explain. My body felt absolutely frozen from the rain I'd caught and from the shock of being so close to something terrible happening. But what scared me the most was when one of the officers pulled me aside and explained that they believed it had been one of my neighbors. The back door of the house had been found open. Whoever had come in had done so using a key. Someone among them had seen me there alone and thought it was the perfect opportunity to take advantage of me. Since then, 3 years have passed and I still live in the same house. Nothing else has happened, but the truth is I suspect one of my neighbors. He's always behaved somewhat strangely toward me, and I avoid being alone with him as much as possible. I don't want to be unfair, so I've never mentioned anything to anyone. Not even told that the police suspected one of them. The community is small and loves gossip. Accepting that it was someone from outside, or some creature from the forest, is easier. Even so, I took all the precautions. I installed a new security system with cameras. I changed all the locks and reinforced the windows. I know I'm safe, but from time to time, I'm still afraid something might happen. That I might slip up, and that it could lead to the worst. I was 25 when this happened, and I had just moved back to West Virginia after living in Ohio for a few years. Money was tight, and I was doing odd jobs through Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. Cleaning barns, dog sitting, small repairs, anything that paid cash. One evening, a man named John reached out. He said he owned a small farm about 40 minutes from my town and needed someone to feed and water his animals for a week while he was away on business. It sounded simple enough. He offered $500 cash up front, which was way more than what I usually made. When I drove out there the first time to meet him, the place was way more isolated than I expected. The gravel driveway went on for what felt like a mile, with no houses in sight. The barn was old, painted a dull red, and the farmhouse was small but neat. John was maybe mid-50s, heavy-set, wearing a faded Carhartt jacket. He talked slowly with a kind of rehearsed politeness that felt off, but not enough to make me leave. People who live that isolated often have quirks. He showed me the chores: a few goats, some chickens, and a horse in a back pasture. He said I'd be sleeping in a little guest room in the farmhouse to keep an eye on things, since there'd been break-ins in the area. He handed me a ring of keys and told me which doors to lock at night. The only thing that made me a little suspicious was how easily he just handed everything over to me, without really talking to me or trying to get to know me. He just put the house keys straight in my hands. The first night was uneventful. I fed the animals, locked up the barn, then went inside. The guest room was tiny, just a twin bed, a dresser, and a small window looking out toward the barn. The second night was different. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a faint clanging sound coming from outside. I sat up and listened. It sounded like the barn door latch. I told myself it had to be the weather. I'd gone to bed with just some rain and wind, but now it was pouring hard. It was pure luck that I heard the sound over the rain at all. When I looked out the window, I could barely make out the barn in the dark, but I swear the main door was moving slightly, like it hadn't been shut all the way. It was absolutely pouring, and the last thing I wanted to do was get out of bed. I made a mental note to check the latch the next day and fix it if needed. But then I felt guilty. After all, the job I'd been given wasn't hard, but it included exactly this: making sure everything was fine. I grabbed the flashlight John left for me and slipped on my boots. Outside, the rain was even heavier, and the only thing I could hear as I walked was the sound of my boots splashing through water. When I finally reached the barn, the door was shut tight. I pulled on it and it didn't budge. I stood there for a moment, scanning the fields around me. Nothing but black shapes of trees and the faint sound of goats shifting inside their pen. I wasn't about to stand there in the rain, so I went back in, locked the door behind me, took a quick shower so I wouldn't go to bed soaked, and tried to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there. John had told me that someone had been sneaking onto the property lately. That was why he'd hired me, and I had definitely seen that door swinging open. When I got there, it was shut. The latch wasn't something that could have closed itself from the rain. The door might have come open for a million reasons: bad weather, my own carelessness. But for it to close again after I'd seen it open? That was definitely a human hand. The next day was all about trying to figure out if someone had been there and fixing some of the things the rain had messed up. It was still raining, but not as hard as at night. But I didn't find any sign that anyone had been there. If there had been footprints, the rain had already washed them away. By the third night, I felt like something was off inside the house. Something I hadn't noticed before and knew wasn't me. It smelled like sweat, but an acidic, weird kind of sweat. At first I thought maybe something had gone bad in the kitchen or there was dirty laundry somewhere. But I couldn't find anything. The smell seemed to be in the living room, the bedrooms, the kitchen, everywhere. After I finished the main chores, I double-checked every window and door, even the ones John said nobody ever uses. Then I sat on the living room couch, thinking about what it could be. I already knew that if I went to bed, I wasn't going to sleep. Around midnight, I went upstairs to the guest room and laid down, scrolling on my phone, when I noticed the air vent above the closet. It was small, about the size of a shoebox lid, with a newer metal grate than the rest of the room. Something about it caught my attention. The screws looked shiny, like it had just been installed. I knew this because I'd noticed the ones in the kitchen were old and dirty and needed cleaning. I'd even made a mental note to clean some of them the next day to make a good impression on John. That's how I knew this one was different. Brand new. I stood up to get a closer look. Through the slats, I could see a faint glint. Glass reflecting light. I pulled a chair over to the closet and climbed on it for a better view. My heart dropped. Something was in there, glued to the slats, and it looked exactly like a tiny camera lens. I unscrewed the grate as fast as I could and confirmed my suspicion. Inside was a small black device wired to a battery pack. The lens was pointed directly at the bed. I climbed down and just stood there holding it, my mind racing. Why on earth would John put a camera in that exact spot? I mean, I could have understood if there were cameras in other parts of the house. After all, he didn't know me and maybe wanted to make sure I wasn't stealing anything. but a camera aimed straight at my bed. That made no sense. Or actually, it did, if his intentions were completely twisted. I felt furious, violated. Not because I'd done anything in that bed, but because just the thought of someone watching me at my most vulnerable while I slept was sickening. At that point, it didn't even cross my mind that I might not be alone in the house. I assumed he was gone and was just watching me remotely. I started going through every single room, trying to find proof that something really bad was going on there. Room by room, my heart pounding harder with each door I opened. When I reached the main bedroom, the one that belonged to John, I noticed a square in the ceiling, clearly leading to an attic. I pushed it open, my hands shaking, and what I found up there left me completely stunned. He was in there, curled up in a corner like he was scared I'd lose it, which, honestly, I probably looked like I would. The tiny attic had 2 monitors streaming a live feed of my bed, and the walls were covered with photos of other people lying in beds. It was sick. I started yelling at him, calling him a coward, telling him to face me, but he just stayed crouched there like he was ashamed of what he'd done. I left right then, even though it was pouring rain outside. The next morning, I called the police and reported everything. What they told me floored me. They already knew something was going on. They'd gotten another complaint, just like mine before, but there was never any proof, and nothing they could do. Still, I begged them to go there, to check the attic. I assume they did, but I never heard another word from the police after that. By then, he probably had already destroyed or hidden whatever evidence was left. I was spending a long weekend at my uncle's cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He'd built it himself back in the 80s. One of those places that looked small from the front but stretched out in the back, with wraparound porches, low tin roofs, and walls lined with dark wood. He let me stay there sometimes when I wanted to get away. It was supposed to be peaceful. That night, it wasn't. It had been raining all day, a thin mist rolling between the trees. But by sunset, the sky broke open, and the rain was pounding like nails on the roof. The closest neighbor was a mile downhill. No cell service unless you stood in the driveway with your phone tilted at just the right angle. This had been a decision my uncle had made, and one that I obviously respected. The cabin was like a sanctuary where bad news didn't reach. The mountains in the rain made everything sound even more magical. I guess it's kind of a universal experience to enjoy being warm inside when the outside world is in turmoil. Inside smelled like cedar and old ash from the fireplace. The power had already flickered twice, and I'd lit some candles just in case. It was the kind of night where you expect the power to go out. I sat on the couch, scrolling through old photos I'd downloaded. I'm a photographer by profession, and that trip to the cabin wasn't just to get some peace, but also a bit of inspiration for a photo shoot I'd been offered. The first thing that got me uneasy was the dog. My uncle's mutt, Penny, was usually dead asleep by 9, especially when my uncle wasn't around. She would stay quieter and not in the mood to play. But that night, she was sitting up near the sliding glass door, ears straight up, tail still. She wasn't barking. She wasn't even growling. Just staring out into the black backyard, like something was out there, When I was younger, I had a cat that in the worst moments would start staring at the walls or into the dark, like he could see something we couldn't. Penny reminded me of him, and I'll admit, I felt a slight shiver. Either way, it wasn't a reason to panic, so I got up, thinking maybe a deer or some other animal had wandered close, and slid the curtain back an inch. Nothing but trees, rain, and the faint glow of my reflection in the glass. But the moment I was about to close it again and go back to the couch, the security light on the back porch clicked on, which only happened if something moved out there. Once again, it could have been any number of animals. So even though I didn't love the idea, there was nothing to do but believe it was nothing serious. So I closed the curtain and sat back down. But Penny didn't move. She stayed in the exact same alert position. A few minutes later, the power cut. Dead quiet except for the rain hammering the roof. Like I said, this was totally expected. In fact, the candles had already been burning for a while, so I wasn't completely in the dark. There was some kind of draft inside the house. Probably a small crack in the wall. I didn't feel cold, but the candle flames wavered, creating all kinds of shadows on the walls. I grabbed the flashlight, clicked it on, and went to check the breaker box in the little hallway closet. The breakers were fine. The power was just out. Out of habit, I opened the back door to see if the porch light was still working off its battery. It was. But the porch itself wasn't empty anymore. There were boot prints in the wet wood leading from the steps to the sliding door I'd just peeked through. And they weren't mine. I swear the simple sight of them gave me a mini heart attack, and I needed a few seconds just to breathe properly again. I needed to stay calm, think concretely and practically. But the idea that whoever it was had been standing at that door terrified me. The cabin had incredibly weak walls. It was just old wood separating me and Penny from whoever was outside. I shut the door quietly, locked it, and killed the flashlight. I backed into the kitchen, trying to think. The only phone was in the guest room upstairs. Anyway, I don't even know why I wanted the phone. The police would take forever to get there. If they even came. I started up the stairs anyway, each step slow. Penny followed at my heels. Halfway up, I heard it. Wood cracking outside. Slow, deliberate steps on wet gravel. Whoever it was moving around the cabin now. I climbed the rest of the stairs, went into the room, and shut the door behind Penny. She was still alert, but looking at her gave me an instinctive fear. She was old, over 18 years, and clearly scared too. That somehow gave me strength. I wasn't just worried about what they could do to me anymore. I had to help Penny get out alive and live the rest of her days in peace. I went to get the shotgun my uncle kept under the bed, locked Penny in the room, and went back downstairs. Through the curtains, I saw the outside light turn on again and felt a stab of dread. I had hoped whoever it was would give up, but they were still there. Gathering courage, I pulled the curtain aside and looked the man on the other side straight in the eyes. We both had a weapon in our hands, both pointing it at each other. The only thing separating us was glass. Then the man, when he saw me, made some strange expression. He gave me a long look and then lowered his weapon. I didn't lower mine, but I asked him what he wanted. He clearly said something, but with the sound of the rain, I couldn't hear. Without lowering my gun, I opened just a crack of the window. The man asked me where the hell my uncle was, and added that if I wanted to stay alive, I'd better answer him. That question clearly left me perplexed, and I could only answer that he wasn't home. The man gave me another long look, and then everything happened too fast for me to process. He fired at the top of the glass, shattering it completely. The glass hit me, and with all the noise I threw myself to the floor. I couldn't tell if he'd actually shot me or not. I looked up, and he was already inside the cabin. I thought I was going to die, but he just punched me and ripped the gun from my hands. Then, he started running through the cabin, opening every door, until he found the one where Penny was. I could only beg him not to hurt her. He turned back until he was next to me again. He told me he'd be back for my uncle, then simply left through the same window he'd come in. When I regained some strength, I got up, put Penny in the car, and drove back to town to file a report. The police came with me, took my statement, and even made a sketch of the man I'd seen. I don't know what my uncle did. He never told me anything. But I know he recognized the man in that sketch. He just apologized and said the cabin would have to stay empty for a while. It's been 7 years since then, and he still hasn't told me a thing. Penny has since passed away, but she died in peace, in my uncle's other house. He never went back to the cabin again, at least as far as I know. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 3 terrifying stories from deep within the Appalachian forests. Stories of people who ventured too far and came face to face with something they'll never forget. From a group of friends who lost one of their own, to a man who hears a voice calling out to him in the darkness, and finally, a birthday celebration in a remote cabin that turns into a night of pure horror. Before we begin, I just want to thank everyone who commented on the last video and shared where you're watching from. It's genuinely amazing to see that this community is growing from all over the world, and that we're all connected. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. Back in 1987, when I was 23, something happened to me and my friends that still haunts me to this day. Everyone's names in this story have been changed, but every single detail is true. I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but the people involved in this story are real people, and something truly terrible happened. I need to tell this to someone. But since I have no right to stir up this story again, at least not by using real names, I'll leave those out. Another thing that needs to be kept in mind is that this all happened many years ago, in 1987, at a time when things were drastically different, from the way you asked for help to the way investigations were conducted. Maybe that's why we never got any real answers about what happened to one of us. So, in October of that year, me and 5 friends decided to do a week-long hike through the Appalachian Mountains. We had already done several hikes and camping trips together, but never in this part of the country, and never so far into the wilderness. We were perfectly aware that our plan was ambitious. About 80 miles from the north entrance down to Pactola Lake. We wanted to disconnect from the city, escape our jobs, and just breathe. Laura was our guide of sorts. She'd been in the National Guard, skilled with maps and compasses, and she kept us all feeling relatively safe. She had always been the kind of person who takes charge of a situation and knows exactly what to do. She was more than prepared to help us survive in nature. What she wasn't prepared for was how cruel and disturbed the minds of some people hiding in that very nature could be. So, we stocked up on food and supplies at a small store in Rapid City. When I mentioned where we were headed, the cashier went pale. "People disappear out there all the time," she said. "There are things out there you don't want to see." We didn't really react at the time because the truth is, we had already heard plenty of ghost stories and other tales about creatures haunting the forest. But in reality, there was never any real proof that any of those stories were true, and we weren't about to give up our adventure just because some people like to make things up. We didn't confront the lady. Everyone believes what they want. We just smiled. But as we were loading the groceries into the car, the man who had been behind us in line came over and told us not to worry about what people said around there. As long as we stayed on the trail, everything would be fine. We thanked him and went on our way. Still, the truth is, that interaction with the man left me more unsettled than I admitted. One thing is people and their superstitions. Another is someone who seemed to know what he was talking about, telling us to stay on the trail. It didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like a warning. And the truth is, we were planning to leave the trail. But no one commented on it, and I didn't want to break the group's spirit, so we just kept going. The first 2 days of hiking were perfect, except for one situation that we kind of ignored. Spirits were high, we were young and in shape, and the forest was beautiful in that crisp October air. Near the end of the first trail, close to the area where we planned to leave the path and explore off-trail, we spotted a camp in the distance. But it was the strangest camp I had ever seen. The tents were in terrible shape, old and torn apart. But worse were the 3 people outside. Each one of them was wearing a white mask. It shocked us not only because of the masks themselves, but because they were wearing them around each other. If they were trying to scare someone, it would make more sense. But no. They were sitting in a circle around a fire, talking to one another. Even though it was obviously disturbing, we were far enough away that they hadn't seen us. At least I thought they hadn't. So we just stayed silent, kept our distance, and got out of there fast. By the next day, our second day, nothing had happened, and we were keeping a good pace. By nightfall, none of us were even talking about those 3 anymore. They had already slipped from our memory. But the third night changed everything, and when I say everything, I really mean it. One of us went into that forest and never came back out. That night, we did exactly what we had done the 2 nights before. We set up camp in a clearing near a creek, splitting between 2 tents. We spent some time around the fire talking, and then one by one everyone drifted off to bed. Even though I was one of the first to lie down, around 3 in the morning I still couldn't sleep. Melissa was awake too, complaining about her back. So we were sitting in her tent, quietly playing cards. That's when we heard it. Soft, crunching footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was someone going to the bathroom, normal in a big group like ours. But 5 minutes passed, then 10, and we didn't hear anything else. Then I looked up from the cards at Melissa and saw the panic on her face. She had peeked through the small window in the side of the tent and had clearly seen something that terrified her. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a scream. I leaned over the flap and saw them. 3 figures, maybe 20 yards from our camp, standing completely still. Masks covered their faces, crude, featureless cloth that hid every expression. And their clothes were ragged, like they had made them themselves. They weren't moving. They weren't talking. They were just watching. I knew immediately it was the same 3 we had seen days before. I gave Melissa the same signal, covering my mouth to stop myself from screaming. Melissa barely breathed. For what felt like an eternity, we didn't move. Then, the zipper of the other tent slid open. We didn't know if it was our friends coming out to investigate the noise, or those 3 who might have moved over to unzip it. We both leaned to see, but it all happened too fast for us to react. A scream cut through the forest. Sharp and short. It was a man's scream, but it didn't sound like anyone we knew. At the same moment, Laura rushed into our tent. She shoved a knife into our hands, her face a mix of panic and the cold determination of someone on a mission. She said the men were back. She didn't know what they wanted, but whatever it was, we had to be ready to fight and run. Then she told us Tom had disappeared. No one knew where he was. She left the tent again and took up a defensive stance right in front of it. Now that the tent was wide open, we could see them clearly. They were still standing there, in exactly the same position, just staring at us. Laura yelled that we were armed and that she had experience. It wasn't true that we were armed, but it was true she had experience, and with the right motivation, she probably could have handled them. But they didn't react. They just stayed put, watching. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in my life. She called out for Tom again, but nothing. The forest around us was completely silent. Nobody moved, waiting for the other to make the first move. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Honestly, I really don't. But Laura insists it was only a short time. They simply turned around and walked back into the woods until we couldn't see them anymore. None of us moved. We didn't know if they would come back. The only thing we knew for sure was that Tom was still missing. We called out for him several times throughout the night. But nothing. None of us dared to venture into the dark forest. By 7, the sun had risen enough that we felt safe moving, searching the area to see where he might be. After an hour with no luck, we knew we had to get help. An investigation was launched that lasted more than 3 weeks. Several volunteers joined the search, but Tom was never found. The only thing discovered was one sock with blood on it. Nothing more. Almost 40 years have passed since then, and we've been told the investigation has been reopened. I hope that this time we'll finally get some answers about what might have happened the night we lost our friend, and that maybe some light will be shed on who those 3 men really were. Get ready. Because what I'm about to tell you is absolutely ridiculous. And, at the same time, for someone who went through and lived what happened, terrifying. Because what I'm about to tell you has been clawing at my brain for over 20 years now. I haven't told a single person face to face, because I know exactly how it sounds. Completely unhinged. But it happened, and the silence has been eating me alive. As I've seen some people say in this type of situation, maybe putting it out here will help me move on. Although, I suspect the only thing it will do is remind me how fragile we really are when we think we're alone in the woods. Either way, here it is. This all went down in October of 1999. If you weren't there, or you were too young, you probably don't realize how different everything was back then. Cell phones already existed, but there wasn't even close to the kind of dependence there is today. No constant tether to someone on the other end of a screen. When you went into the woods in '99, you were gone. If something happened, you were on your own. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, although I think the magic has been completely lost. My goal in saying this is simply to give a fact that in a way is important to the story. I didn't have a cell phone. So, going back to that time, I used to be a hardcore hiker, backpacking every chance I got through Tennessee, North Carolina, even up into Virginia. For years, I'd hit the trails almost every other weekend. I wasn't reckless, but I loved going solo. No chatter, no phones, just me and the sound of my boots on dirt. It was the closest thing to peace I ever found. But life got in the way. Work piled up, relationships went sideways, and before I knew it, years had passed since I'd done a real trip. Until that fall of '99. When I finally snapped out of it and decided I was done wasting time. I dug out my old gear, cleaned off my stove, unfolded the creased paper topo maps, and picked a trail in the Smokies I'd always wanted to try. A stretch so remote that back then there wasn't any other trail nearby. I gave myself 4 days, enough to shake the rust off, but not so long I'd be dragging myself home broken. I prepped like I always did. Extra food, emergency pack, compass, and a battered flashlight with spare batteries. But I can admit now that I was cocky. I thought the years hadn't dulled me as much as they had. Day 1 was perfect. Cool breeze, clear sky, and the constant sound of leaves being crushed underfoot. My legs burned. But it was that good burn. The kind that makes you remember you're alive. The forest smelled like damp moss and old pine needles, and the streams were still running high from September rains. I didn't see another human after the parking lot. That night, though, things shifted. It wasn't anything obvious. Just this nagging sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I'd set up camp beside a small clearing, got a fire going, cooked my usual dehydrated meal, and the whole time, it felt like someone was watching from the tree line. I kept glancing up mid-bite, expecting to catch a pair of eyes reflecting back. But there was nothing but darkness. It's important to say that at this point I wasn't scared at all. I was just alert. To survive when we're completely isolated, you can't just switch off your intuition. It exists for a reason. Besides, I'd already encountered my fair share of crazy people on trails I'd hiked before. In all those cases when I ran into weirdos or more dangerous situations, what saved me was precisely using my intuition, trusting my instincts. So this experience wasn't going to be any different. Sure, it's true that I hadn't gone on a trail like this in a few years. But I still knew what it felt like when something wasn't right. When you're being watched. So that night I took the proper precautions. I kept my food away from the campsite and laid several dry branches around the tent. If someone or some animal approached, I'd have time to hear it. But, aside from the feeling, nothing else happened that night. So I moved on. The second day, I pushed deeper. The path narrowed, climbed hard in spots, cut across ridges where the wind howled like a freight train. It was beautiful. But every so often, I'd get this flash of movement just beyond the corner of my vision. Once I swore, I saw something slipping behind a tree about 50 yards off. A shape low to the ground, pale against the dark bark. Obviously, I stood still trying to figure out what kind of animal it could be, and whether I was in danger. But after a few minutes, nothing happened. It was as if nothing had been there at all. By the time I set camp again, I was a bit on edge. I'd had some uncomfortable signs during the day, and I knew perfectly well they weren't monkeys in my head. My fire that night felt less like comfort and more like a barrier, light keeping whatever was out there away. I was stirring the coals when I heard it. Not footsteps, exactly, but something heavy, shifting on soft ground. Too deliberate for the wind, and too steady to be a random sound of the forest. My chest locked up. Bears crossed my mind. But this didn't sound like that. It wasn't crashing. It wasn't snuffling around. It was controlled and maybe calculated. Instinctively, I grabbed my light and swept the trees. But once again, I couldn't see anything. The fire also didn't help. It was great for seeing what was close, but it obscured anything beyond its light. Then, out of the corner of the firelight, I saw it. A low and almost crawling movement. Balanced on 4 limbs, sliding between the trunks with this wrong, uneven rhythm. My brain screamed, animal. But no animal I'd ever seen moved like that. Its skin, or fur, or whatever it was, seemed too pale, almost gray-blue in the firelight. Like something that hadn't seen sunlight in a long, long time. In fact, I'd only managed to see it among the trees because it clearly wasn't an animal that needed to camouflage itself. Even so, I could only see part of it. My brain was working overtime trying to figure out what kind of animal it was and what the best plan would be. And then, my own voice came out of the dark. Clear as if I was standing 5 feet behind me. "Wanna play?" It was like the ground fell out from under me. Cold shot through my whole body. My heart stuttered. I didn't move, and I didn't breathe. Every instinct screamed to react, to do something. But I knew, with a certainty I can't explain, that answering back would be the end of me. I sat frozen, staring into the trees, gripping the handle of my knife like a lifeline. I already knew not to leave the fire. I stayed as close to it as possible. I kept the flame alive, feeding it every piece of wood I had, praying it would keep the dark at bay. Whatever was out there didn't leave. I could hear it circling, shifting. Sometimes close enough I swore I could feel the vibration in the dirt. It never crashed through the underbrush. It slid. Like it knew exactly how to move without a sound. I know it's hard to picture what I'm saying, but this is exactly what I felt at the time. And then again, I heard my own voice. At this point, I didn't understand what was said, but something was clearly said, and the voice was still mine. I wanted to scream, to charge into the woods swinging, to scare it off, to do anything but sit there like prey. But I knew in my bones that reacting was what it wanted. So I stayed still, clenched my teeth, eyes locked on the tree line, until dawn broke. When the sun finally lit the forest, I didn't waste a second. I didn't pack my tent. I didn't touch my stove. I shoved my emergency kit into my pack and bolted down the trail like hell was chasing me. I ran until my legs were jelly and until I saw the gravel road and my car. Then I just peeled out without looking back. I've never told anyone except my brother until now. Not because I don't want to be believed, but because I don't even believe myself. What do you even call that? A hallucination? A psychotic break? But the thing is, I don't drink from random streams. I don't eat berries. I didn't take anything that could have poisoned me. The idea that I randomly hallucinated my own voice out there feels as absurd as the alternative. And yet, I can still hear it. The tone, the cadence. It was, without any shadow of a doubt, my exact voice. It's been over 2 decades and I haven't set foot back in the Smokies. I don't know if I ever will. Everything I'm about to tell you happened at the end of October 1987, when I had just turned 20 years old. Just so you know, things back then were very different from what they are now. We were more united as a society, and it breaks my heart to see how divided we've become. Anyway, that's just something I wanted to share. Like I said, I had just turned 20, and to celebrate properly, my closest group of friends and I decided to spend 5 days in a cabin isolated deep in the woods. It wasn't just any cabin either. It belonged to one of my friend's uncles. 4 guys who had grown up together in the same little corner of Western Virginia, just close enough to the Appalachian ridges to think the mountains were our backyard. The cabin was more like an oversized hunting shack, set back in the woods. No electricity, no running water. But it had 4 walls and a roof, and to us, that was paradise. We didn't have any plans for those days except drinking beer, talking by the campfire, and maybe going on a hike or 2. The first 3 nights were exactly that. The cabin was rough. Old timber, warped shutters, a wood stove that filled the room with smoke if you fed it too much at once. But we didn't care. We cooked hot dogs on sticks, drank cheap beer until we couldn't feel the cold, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the wind moving through the trees. It was simple, and it was good. Those were definitely good times. The 4th and final night was when things changed. That night was much colder and damper than the ones before. Instead of being outside by a fire, we stayed inside the cabin. As usual, we kept the windows slightly open to let some air in and keep the smoke from building up inside. Around midnight, as we were sitting on the couch, Evan and I both saw something. The problem was, we saw the same thing, but in opposite windows. Out there in the pitch-black forest, something glimmered back at us. A pair of eyes. We both jumped up at the same time and realized we were looking at the same thing. Luckily, we reacted fast. All 4 of us understood what was happening and rushed to close the windows and double-check the door. We stayed alert. None of us knew what was out there. All we had seen was what looked like a pair of eyes low to the ground. We weren't exactly scared yet. The area was known for wild animals, and since the eyes were so low, we figured it might be wolves. The fact that we had seen more than one pair of eyes and seen them in opposite windows almost confirmed it. They must have been animals moving in a pack, possibly hunting together. At that point, we still hadn't closed the shutters, so we could still see out into the woods. But there was nothing more to see than the vastness of the forest and the darkness between the trees. At one point, Frederick said what he'd seen wasn't an animal. He said it in such an absolute, unnerving way that I immediately knew he wasn't joking. We shut the shutters then, but even so, we still didn't know what we had seen. Frederick himself, after saying that, couldn't explain what he'd seen. He just kept saying it wasn't an animal. He didn't know what it was. Maybe a very sick or deformed animal. We kept pressing him with questions, and he just said he didn't know, but that the best thing was to keep the shutters closed. For hours, we heard noises outside the cabin. Obviously, none of us were going to sleep that night. We heard something crawling around outside, something scratching at the wood. It was absolutely terrifying. I really thought it was a pack of wolves, maybe hungry ones. But then we heard whatever it was climb onto the roof and start moving from one side to the other. Wolves were agile, but I didn't think they could climb that high. Maybe cougars, I thought. But cougars rarely hunted in groups. All through that night we talked through every possible scenario. We grabbed whatever objects we could use to defend ourselves in case the cabin wasn't strong enough and gave way. The idea was terrifying, mostly because we didn't know what was on the other side. We even talked about the possibility that it could be people. But Frederick said, if they were people, they were highly deformed. Not to mention, I had seen the eyes low to the ground, which meant if it was a person, they were crawling on all fours. The idea that it could be people was horrifying. Not just because we didn't know their intentions, but because we didn't know what could be happening to them to make them act like that. At that time, it was common to hear talk about feral people, but nothing had ever been proven. When morning finally came and we hadn't heard any noises for a while, we opened the shutters to look outside. Nothing. The forest was still and serene, just like it had been every other day. But the ground was clearly trampled, like several people or animals had been circling the cabin. We couldn't make out distinct footprints, at least not from where we were. So the doubt remained about what had been out there. We packed up the rest of our things, and only when we opened the door and stepped outside did we realize it couldn't have been animals. The scratching noises we'd heard the night before had been to make all those marks on the cabin. The cabin was completely covered in them, but they weren't just random scratches that any animal could have made. They were symbols, drawings even, something only a person could have done. We got out of there as fast as we could. When we told my friend's uncle what had happened, he and a couple of his friends searched the woods around the cabin, trying to figure out what had gone on, but they never found anything. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're diving into 3 truly terrifying stories that took place deep within the most remote and isolated parts of the Appalachian wilderness. From something caught on the security cameras of someone living completely off the grid, to a home invasion that still haunts its victim, and finally, an investigation that remains unsolved to this day. To me, these stories are as fascinating as they are disturbing. I don't know about you, but there's something about those lonely, far-off places that's beautiful. and deeply unsettling. The untouched wilderness, the silence, it gets under your skin. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. What I'm about to tell you started happening frequently and disturbingly not long ago. Maybe 2 weeks. Though I actually think it might have been going on for longer. I just didn't want to believe it. About 5 years ago, I hit a massive crisis. I'd always seen myself as the type of person who thrived on work. I held important positions, and working was my personality. I think everyone knows at least one friend like that. The one who can never do anything, or cancels at the last minute because of work. I look back at those days with sadness now, realizing I sacrificed everything in life for my job. But at the time, I didn't see it like that. On the contrary, I was proud of being the one always on top of deadlines, literally living to work. And then, out of nowhere, without warning and without a specific trigger I could identify, I stopped being able to keep up. I grew depressed. I started missing deadlines, sleeping in, having insomnia. I began isolating myself. Before, I didn't see my friends because I was working. Now I didn't see them because I didn't even have the strength to get off the couch. And when I say strength, I don't mean physical. When I finally went to the doctor, convinced I had some terrible disease, he told me it was burnout. I was shocked. In my personal dictionary, that word wasn't real. Certainly not for me. In my head, that happened to lazy people. People looking for excuses not to work. But I fell so low that I had to accept it was real and that I was going through it. Now that I've given you some context, maybe it's easier to understand why I reached what many of you might see as a dramatic, even radical conclusion. The only way to break this toxic relationship with work was to change my life completely. Another thing about me is that once I set my mind on a goal, I follow through without looking back. So when I decided to live as off the grid as possible, within a year, I was doing it. I'd always lived relatively close to the Appalachians, so when it came time to choose a new home, those mountains felt like the perfect place. After some research, I found a spot on Spruce Mountain that was perfect. Dirt cheap compared to what I paid in the city. I bought it without thinking twice, and within a year I was relatively adjusted. Sure, it's a massive shift, moving from the city to the middle of nowhere. But like I said, when I set a goal, I'm obsessed with it. I'll just give you some notions of the land. The house itself isn't huge. It has 2 floors, but even so, it's not big compared to the land around it. That, yes, is enormous, and in reality, it's completely isolated. It takes me at least 45 minutes by car to reach the nearest village, and if I go on foot, then it's more than a day's walk. But that's exactly what I wanted. I've been living here for about 5 years now, the last 3 of which were pretty peaceful. The best decision I've ever made. At least until about 6 months ago. More disturbingly, the last 2. Living isolated means I spend a lot of time on the outskirts of the house. I try to be as self-sufficient as possible, and I produce most of my own food. Obviously, I'm not a full-on hermit. I have a car, I go to town sometimes. But still, I spent very little time actually inside four walls. Nothing really strange had ever happened on my property. A few lunatics had passed by. But like I said, about 6 months ago I started noticing strange things. One night, I was sitting in the living room reading a book about monocultures when I heard a knock at the window behind me. The window was closed, but the shutters were open. The only thing I could see outside was the darkness of the trees. I stayed still for a while, but nothing. So I ignored it and went back to my book. The next day, passing by that same window, I noticed finger marks on the shutter, like someone had been peeking inside, pressing both hands there. There was no doubt they were fingers, even if they were unnervingly long and thin, more than you'd expect from a normal person. But whatever. I thought maybe it was some unlucky wanderer, like the others I'd seen before, and ignored it. What made me uncomfortable was realizing I had been sitting with my back turned while someone was right there, mere inches away, watching me. A few days later, I was in the same spot, this time with the shutter closed, when I heard what sounded like footsteps outside, followed by a whistle. I'm not even sure if it was a whistle. I just know it was a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. I stayed alert for long minutes, listening, but there was nothing else. Just silence pressing in. I even considered the possibility that it had been something else entirely, or that I'd imagined it. But the way every hair on my body had stood on end told me my body had reacted, physically, instinctively. A few days later, I was in the kitchen heating up a late meal when I noticed movement among the trees. I looked closer and saw a shadow. I call it a shadow because I don't know what it was. I only know it stood on 2 legs and looked like a deformed man. I grabbed my shotgun and went to the front door, yelling what it wanted and warning that if it didn't leave, it would regret it. Days passed without anything else happening. Then one night, I was in bed upstairs when a stone struck my bedroom window. Not big enough to break it, just enough to get my attention. I peeked out and saw the same shadow among the trees again. Too dark to make out details, but I assumed it was someone trying to scare me. The thing that unnerved me the most was its head. It was distinctly lighter than the rest of its body, a stark shape against the darkness. I couldn't tell what it actually was, and the distance made it impossible to discern. I felt that instinctive fear again. My house is secure. I never leave anything open. Still, I went from room to room. Everything was locked. The house had been built to offer solid protection. But that was the first time I had a bad feeling, knowing I had a stalker who was either insane or had bad intentions. The next day, I did something I'd never needed to do before. I contacted several alarm companies, and that same night I installed 4 cameras around the perimeter, 1 for each cardinal direction. But nothing. The cameras picked up only small animals here and there. Until about 2 weeks ago, when they finally caught something. I'd mostly stopped checking them because I'd never seen anything. But that night, after taking out the trash, I felt almost certain something was watching me. I slammed the door, locked everything, and went upstairs to the computer streaming the live footage. For the longest time, nothing. Just the dark forest, which is terrifying in its own right. And then, out of nowhere, movement. I went instantly on alert, and then I saw it. camera quality isn't great, but you can clearly make out someone stepping out from the trees wearing a deer head as a mask. I was stunned. It's a horrifying sight, and I didn't even fully understand what I was looking at. But I decided, whatever it was, I'd do the same as I always had in life. Face it. I went downstairs, grabbed my shotgun, opened the door, and shouted at the top of my lungs that if I saw it again, I'd shoot. I spent the rest of the night on full alert, glued to the cameras. That image burned into my brain. The next day, I barely went outside, and whenever I did, I was armed. When night fell, my muscles locked up. Whatever it was, it didn't seem like threats would make it go away. I'd already threatened it before, and if I was right, this had been going on for months. I stayed staring at the camera footage for hours. There was nothing there except the forest, which, as I said, is terrifying. Then, after about 2 hours of complete darkness, he appeared. Standing in the exact same spot as the night before. I froze again, completely paralyzed by the image. It was real. I hadn't dreamed it. I tried taking a picture of the screen, but you can't make out anything clearly. When I finally managed to break free from that wave of panic, I went back downstairs, opened the door, scanned the trees with my gun. When I saw its shadow, I fired. It didn't move. It stood there, impassive and serene, staring exactly as it had before. I've always been good with guns. My father had many, and I grew up around them. I knew I hadn't missed. But how was that possible? Panicking, I shut the door and ran back to the cameras. And there it was, staring straight into the lens as if it knew the camera was there. Right now, I'm desperate. I don't know what to do. I don't understand what I'm facing. I don't know what it is. Every night it appears and spends the whole night staring into the camera. By morning, it's gone. I'm sleep deprived and seriously considering seeing a psychiatrist. Has anyone ever faced or even heard of something like this? I need answers before I lose my mind completely. All of this happened not long ago, and I have to admit, if there hadn't been other people with me, it would have seemed like some scene straight out of a movie. Unreal. Writing this now feels like an attempt to process what I went through, maybe even understand it. I've lived in West Virginia my whole life. When I finally had the money to buy a house, it never even crossed my mind to move to another state. Even though my work-from-home job gives me the flexibility to live anywhere, I always like the isolation. In fact, my goal was to find a place as secluded as possible. 2 of my friends knew I was looking for a house, and exactly what I wanted. So when one of them sent me an online listing, I instantly knew it was perfect for me. After 2 years of slowly making repairs, the place was finally ready for me to move in. It's completely cut off from everything, way more isolated than I'd initially imagined. When I'd go hiking, it felt like I was the only person left on Earth, and I loved that. The house itself was pretty big, with 2 floors, 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and more room than I ever really needed. The land around it is thick, full of dense trees, with an old trail running down the hillside that's no longer in use. My old place is about an hour and 50 minutes away by car, and that's the closest big area. There are a few other houses near mine, but they're completely isolated and still way too far to be considered neighbors. I can scream my head off out here and nobody would hear me. Or at least, no one was supposed to be close enough to hear me. Since I moved here, I've had friends visit. Mostly when they want a little getaway, or to experience what it's like to live completely off the grid. They live in towns or cities, and even though the forest surrounds them, it's still a distant experience. Out here in my cabin, I'm literally living in the middle of the woods. About a week ago, my cousin David came up with a friend of his, Cedric. David's the kind of guy who thinks he knows how to handle anything outdoors. He grew up camping and hunting with his dad, while I only started appreciating isolation later in life. I knew it was going to be a shock for him. Honestly, even for David. He's used to the woods, but not for more than a day at a time. The first day was amazing. We spent it unpacking, prepping food, stacking firewood by the door. It was late October, the days already shorter and the air cooler. Lighting the fireplace is a tradition. But as expected, after one day, David started getting restless and wanted to explore a trail before sunset. He left without a backpack or flashlight, saying he'd be back in half an hour. Cedric and I stayed inside the cabin. He was flipping through a book he'd brought. I don't know how much time passed before I realized it had gotten way too dark for David to still be out there. Not long after, Cedric came up to me asking the same thing. Shouldn't David be back by now? The sun had completely vanished behind the mountains, and the weak moonlight was the only light left. We waited a little longer. Like I said, David's experienced, and I was convinced he'd be back soon. But another hour passed in pitch blackness before I said I was going after him. Cedric started putting on his coat as if he was coming with me. I couldn't bring myself to say no. But honestly, I didn't want to head out into the night with someone totally inexperienced. I asked him to stay in case David showed up. He nodded. He understood it was important for someone to stay behind, and I felt relieved. I grabbed my flashlight, a small kit I always keep ready, and told Cedric I was going to check on David. I started down the trail slowly. At first, it was just that usual discomfort you feel being alone in the woods at night. Especially in these forests, these mountains. Everything intensifies at night, and all those daytime legends you laugh at suddenly feel like real threats. Still, I wasn't walking scared. I was sure I'd find him quickly, probably with a small injury. I walked until, somehow, I knew I wasn't alone on the trail. I turned around more than once, expecting to see eyes glinting in the distance, but nothing. Still, I was sure I heard footsteps besides my own. I called out for David, told him we were worried, that this wasn't the time for jokes. We needed to get back to the house. Nothing. The forest was empty of sound. I pressed on, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. 5 minutes later, I saw David coming toward me. He wasn't running, but he was moving fast. His body tense, shoulders stiff, arms rigid. Even from a distance, I could see him glancing over his shoulder. When he saw me, I felt him relax just a little, but he clearly picked up his pace. I tried asking what was going on, but he only muttered that we needed to get out of there, back to the cabin. I didn't question it. I immediately knew something was wrong, and my earlier sense was probably right. So we hurried back to the cabin, and only once we'd locked the door did he tell me someone had been following him. A man standing between the trees, not saying a word, just staring and trailing him. Cedric was clearly shaken, And I, worried that the situation might spiral into something bigger than it was, told them not to worry. We'd lock all the doors and windows. It was probably just some guy pulling a prank, trying to scare off people walking near his property. Someone from one of the isolated cabins nearby, maybe. But he immediately corrected me, saying that this man definitely didn't live in one of those cabins. He looked like he actually lived out there in the woods. He was filthy and seemed like he was under the influence of something. After peeking out the windows and seeing nothing, we made dinner, played some games, and went to bed. I did my best to keep myself and Cedric calm, but nothing could get David to relax. A couple of days passed without incident. David finally started to relax, and so did I. I'd never had problems before. I didn't want to start now. One of the warmer nights, we lit a fire outside and sat talking. Cedric and I were calm, but David kept glancing at the forest every now and then. I realized maybe that scare had been a lot worse for him than I'd given him credit for. He was clearly still rattled. The next day, we decided to do the big hike David had wanted. But this time, he wouldn't be going alone. We climbed up to a nearby peak, took hours, and came back exhausted. At some point on the trail, that same uneasy feeling came back, the one I'd felt 3 days earlier when David had gone missing. But scanning the trees carefully, I didn't see anything. When we got back, David asked if he could shower first. He said he had a slight headache and maybe the shower would help. None of us minded, of course, so I stayed in the living room with Cedric. He was clearly exhausted. He wasn't used to that kind of physical exertion, so he wasn't saying much. At some point, I realized the sound of running water hadn't even started. A lot of time had passed. Even if David was doing something else in the bathroom, he would have told us if he'd be a while. That wasn't like him. I mentioned it to Cedric, but by now he was half asleep. Had I dozed off too? I looked at the clock. An hour and a half had gone by since we'd returned. I must have nodded off. David had probably already finished showering. I got up and went to the bedroom. I knocked and called for David, but there was no answer. My hand went to the doorknob. I could feel something was wrong. My heart was pounding without me even knowing why. I opened the door slowly. What I saw is something I'll never forget. David was kneeling in the corner, eyes wide, locked on me, shaking his head slightly as if telling me not to come in. Next to him stood a man, taller than me, so thin he looked sick. Long, black, greasy hair hung over his shoulders. But the worst part was his eyes, bulging, open too wide, an exhausted and empty stare fixed on David. I asked what the hell was going on, stepping toward them. Only halfway into the movement did I notice the man had something raised, a weapon. I looked at David. A thin line of blood was running down the side of his head. I asked again what was happening, and the man shouted that David had stolen his son. We were both stunned, not knowing what to say. Cedric must have heard the noise because the next thing I knew, he was at the doorway asking what was happening. That was enough to make the man glance at him, and in that split second I kicked at the hand holding the weapon. A shot rang out, and for a few seconds I couldn't tell if I, or anyone, had been hit. David reacted instantly, shoving the man to the ground. He wasn't yelling words, just high-pitched sounds, a mix between a scream and a growl. Everything was happening at once. At some point I felt a sharp pain in my arm. The man had just bitten me. By now, Cedric had grabbed the gun from the floor and was pointing it at the man, asking what the hell was going on. who he was. David said this was the guy who'd been following him during his hike. Now I understood why he'd been so scared. The man's appearance was bizarre. Looking at him was a mix of terror and pity. I asked him again what he wanted, but by now he was just whimpering. None of us knew what to do. Probably call for help. He didn't seem like a huge threat anymore. He looked more like someone utterly miserable. Then, Cedric said something that clearly set him off. He commented that the man looked like he'd come straight out of an asylum. At that word, the man went completely berserk. Lunged at Cedric, knocking him to the floor and slamming his head against the edge of the furniture. Then he bolted down the stairs and vanished. I tried to go after him, but he ran fast, and I wasn't about to throw myself into the woods at night again. It's been 4 months since then. I've never seen the man again. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. David says he has no idea what the guy meant about his son. We don't even know how he got into the house while David was in the bathroom and we were sitting in the living room. All the doors and windows were locked. I still live here, but I'm always on edge, watching for when he might come back. What I'm about to tell you happened on October 21st, 2001, when I was on a 5-day hike in the Appalachians, more specifically near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. The first 3 days were pretty interesting. The trail turned out to be more challenging than I had expected, and at one point I lost one of my backpacks. Don't ask me how it happened because I honestly have no idea. I just had it with me. And then, when I went to grab something from it later, it was gone. Given what happened afterward, I can't rule out the possibility that someone might have actually stolen it without me even noticing. Luckily, it wasn't a huge deal. The pack had some food, but I always brought extra. So, I still had more than enough for the next few days. It wasn't until the 4th day, around midday, that I came across something. At first, I only saw a blue tent in the distance, so my first thought was that I wasn't alone after all. There was someone else camping out there. To stay on my planned route, I had to pass right by the campsite. But obviously I wasn't just going to walk up and give someone a heart attack, or risk getting shot. So I tried calling out, saying hi, and explaining that I just wanted to pass through and keep going. But no one answered. I figured maybe they were out hiking or gathering firewood, so I thought I could safely go on my way. But as I got closer, I started noticing some details that really didn't add up. The first thing was that there was a sleeping bag, half inside and half outside the tent, with a bunch of stuff scattered around on the ground. The camp stove had been knocked over, and a little farther ahead, there was a blue sweatshirt covered in blood. That froze me right where I stood. Something had clearly gone down at that campsite. In a place that remote, your first thought is usually that it was an animal attack. But after looking closer, I saw the tent was full of food. Even the bag with the scattered stuff still had food in it. No animal would have just left that behind. At that point, I got really uneasy and realized I needed to turn back. So that's what I did. I wasn't afraid of walking through the forest at night. I'd done it countless times before. So I just started heading back. That's when, near a small creek, I came across a cell phone lying between 2 small rocks. I picked it up, figuring it would probably be dead or locked with a pin. But back in the early 2000s, people didn't always use pins, and phone batteries lasted forever. This one still had some charge left. What I found on that phone chilled me to the bone. There were a bunch of photos, which I obviously can't show since they're in police custody. But they showed several different angles of the forest, and in all of them, you could see a man. In some pictures, the man was partially hidden among the trees. In others, he was more visible, but you could never clearly make out his face, partly because old phone cameras were terrible, and partly because many of the shots were blurry, like whoever was taking them was trying to document something while running away at the same time. What scared me the most about the whole sequence of photos was that the last one had been taken right there, exactly where I was standing. That completely shocked me. It was getting dark, and I knew I had to get out of there as fast as I could. Thankfully, I made it out of that forest without anything happening. But the person who owned that phone was never found. To this day, they remain missing. Since I was directly involved in the investigation, I can't and won't reveal the person's name. Out of respect for the family, for the person themselves, and because the case still hasn't been officially closed. But it was horrifying to be out there in the middle of nowhere, realizing that something terribly wrong had just happened moments before, knowing that whoever did it might still have been somewhere in those woods, and that the person hadn't even been reported missing yet when I found that campsite.